The tea was awful, bitter, overbrewed, and steeped just wrong. But floating at the bottom was a single dry chrysanthemum petal, and that was what broke Ethan in two. Because chrysanthemum is a remedy for insomnia, which meant that this trembling girl who brought him the tea had noticed the dark circles under his eyes and was trying to help in the only way she knew. But before the tea, we must go back. The first thing Ethan Reyes feels is cold. Not winter cold, the cold of a foreign body that doesn't know how to breathe under its new master. He opens his eyes. Above him is a dark wood ceiling with a crack running across the entire room like a scar on an old man's face. The air smells musty and slightly sweet, like something dead. He tries to sit up, and his body responds with a half-second delay, like a poorly calibrated joystick. His arms are thin, his fingers are long and white, not his arms. And inside, something snaps. This isn't a dream.
Dreams don't smell like mold, and your ribs don't ache when you turn over. Two voices are speaking behind the door, a woman's and a man's. Servants. For 3 seconds, he doesn't understand the language, and then the words enter his head like a firmware update, abruptly, without warning. The woman's voice mutters that the poor gentleman has taken a good-for-nothing as his wife. The man replies that 2 beggars under one roof isn't even a tragedy. It's a joke. Both laugh. Ethan stands up. He walks to the mirror. Staring back at him is a skinny guy in his 20s with dark circles under his eyes and cheekbones that jut out too sharply. The face of a man who long ago stopped expecting anything good. He raises his hand. The reflection raises its hand, clenches a fist. The reflection mimics the gesture. A perfect match. He exhales. A foreign body. An unfamiliar world. The language loaded itself. There's only one conclusion. He's no longer in soul. Panic rises from his stomach to his throat.
He catches it. Not now. Data first. Then emotions. Always data first. On the table is a scroll with a red ribbon and a wax seal. He unrolls it. A marriage contract between the 3rd son of Baron Reyes and the daughter of the dying Songhwa clan. The bride, Songhwa Sehyun. The date is yesterday. No dowry except for an old house and personal belongings. There are 2 seals at the bottom. One is fresh and vivid, the other is pale, almost invisible. As if the Songhwa family didn't even have enough ink for their own signature. Ethan puts the scroll down. So he's married. To a girl they call a nobody. And the body of a guy considered worthless. In a world he knows nothing about. He looks in the mirror and nods to his reflection. He's an engineer. His whole life, he's taken systems that don't work and made them work. The algorithm is the same. Gather data, find connections, understand the architecture, fix it. He steps out into the hallway.
Dark and long. The walls, once white, are now streaked with gray. The floor creaks with every step. Those very servants freeze against the far wall. The woman with the red face bows quickly. The man with the bucket more slowly, without respect, out of duty. Ethan walks past in silence. Not out of pride, he simply doesn't know what the master says to the servants when they meet. Lack of data. Any word is a mistake. Silence is safer. He counts the doors. 7. Behind the open doors are empty rooms, dust, furniture covered in cloth. The house is large, but dead, like a server that's been unplugged but not dismantled. He steps out into the courtyard. Stone walls along the perimeter, a gate made of dark wood. One leaf hangs on the single hinge, the other lies on the ground, already overgrown with moss. In the center is a well with a crooked lid. To the left, overgrown bushes that were once a garden. To the right, a building with a collapsed roof. His mind compiles a list on its own. The gate, the roof, the well, the garden. Everything needs repair. Everything. He turns toward the house and sees her. Small, thin, black hair, pale skin, eyes downcast, a cup in her hands. She holds it so tightly her knuckles turn white, as if the cup is the only thing keeping her in place. Sehyun, his wife. He approaches. He stops 2 steps away. He can't get any closer. Closer means pressure. He knows this not from books, but from working with people who are afraid, people who are only approached to be hurt. She holds out the cup without looking up. Tea. He takes it. His fingers touch hers. Her skin is ice cold. The tea has gone cold. The color is murky. The water was too hot. It steeped too long. The leaves are cheap. But a dry, pale yellow petal floats on the surface. A chrysanthemum. Ethan freezes. Chrysanthemum isn't in any tea recipe he knows. It's an addition. Intentional. Why? Her gaze darts to his face for a second, to the circles under his eyes, and returns downward. And he understands. The chrysanthemum is for insomnia. She noticed he hadn't been sleeping well, and she put the petal in. Not because she knows how to brew tea, but because she wanted to help in the only way she knew how. He takes a sip. Bitter, but the petal leaves a subtle sweetness on his tongue that almost hides the bitterness. Almost. He tells her that chrysanthemum tea is for insomnia, that she noticed the dark circles under his eyes. Sehyun freezes, completely, like someone caught doing something forbidden. Then she slowly nods, and the world changes. A translucent bluish window unfolds before Ethan's eyes. Text he reads, though none of these letters belong to any alphabet he knows. Synergy system activated. First contact with linked object established. Module open. Songhwa Herin, herbalist healer, 847 years ago. Information floods into his mind in a torrent, not as text, sensations. He suddenly knows which herbs grow in that overgrown garden. He knows that the crooked tree by the well is a wild plum, and its bark reduces inflammation. He knows that Sehyun's pallor and trembling hands aren't just her nature, it's chronic weakness, iron deficiency, poor circulation, and he knows how to treat it. 3 ingredients from the garden, 1 from the kitchen. He opens his eyes. The window disappears. The knowledge remains, like a downloaded file. He looks at Sehyun. She expects him to say the tea is bad, expects him to turn away, expects the usual. He says thank you, says the tea is good. She looks up, for the first time, for a single second, and in her eyes there is neither gratitude nor joy, distrust.
the fragile, cautious distrust of a person who has been spoken to kindly and who is waiting for a catch. She lowers her gaze, nods, and almost runs away. Ethan stands in the courtyard of the dead house with a cup of bad tea. He watches her go. Then at the garden, then back at the cup where a chrysanthemum petal is slowly sinking.
All right. He sets the cup on the edge of the well, rolls up his sleeves. First stop, the garden. He needs 3 herbs, white clover root for iron, silver mint leaf for blood, night aster flower for sleep. Heron tells him that all 3 grow by the north wall, and Ethan goes into the garden. The garden didn't want to let him in. The bushes were so thickly tangled that he couldn't slip a hand between them. The branches of old trees hung down to the ground, forming living walls. The paths were overgrown with waist-high grass. Ethan stood at the edge of this thicket and looked at it as if it were a server room after a flood. Everything is tangled. Everything was intertwined. But there was a system. It was simply hidden beneath layers of chaos. He started at the edge. He pushed the branches aside with his hands. His feet, in thin house slippers, got wet within the first minute. The ground was damp and soft. It smelled of rotting leaves and something bitter. Heron was guiding him. Not with words, not with a voice, with sensations in his fingertips. He touched a plant and knew. It's a weed. It's medicine. It's poison. It's food. 20 minutes later, he found the first ingredient. White clover grew right by the northern wall, right between the stones. The roots went deep into the masonry. Ethan dug with his hands because there was no shovel. Dirt got under his fingernails. His fingers ached. The new master's body was weak and unaccustomed to physical labor, but the root came out of the ground intact, long, white, with a distinctive sweetish scent. The second ingredient was found more quickly. Silver mint grew in a whole meadow by the ruined gazebo. The leaves were small and covered in silvery fuzz. Ethan plucked a bunch and held it to his face. The scent hit his nose sharply and cleanly. Heron approved. A sensation of warmth at the back of his neck, like a nod from within. The third component proved to be a problem. Night aster. Heron remembered that it grew by the east wall near the old fountain. Ethan found the fountain, a stone basin cracked in half. The water was long gone. Dead leaves lay at the bottom. Nothing grew around the fountain. Bare earth. He stood and looked. Heron was silent. She wasn't refusing to help. She just didn't know. 800 years ago, the aster had been here. Now it was gone. Ethan crouched down and began examining the ground around the fountain. Soil was dry. Strange. The whole garden was damp, but here it was dry. He dug with his hand. Beneath the top layer, the soil was different. Dense, gray, like clay. He dug deeper. His fingers struck something hard. A stone. No, not a stone. A tile. A stone circle had been laid out underground around the fountain. A drainage channel. Someone had deliberately drained this area. Ethan sat down on the ground and thought for 3 minutes. Then he stood up and went to look for a water source. There was a well in the yard. There was a rope. There was a bucket. The bucket was wooden with iron hoops, and half the hoops were rusted through, but it held. He drew some water, brought it to the fountain, poured it onto the dry ground around the basin, then another bucket, and another. 4 buckets. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. His back ached.
This guy's body was definitely not used to hard work. He sat down nearby and waited. An hour passed. Nothing happened. He sat in the wet mud by the broken fountain in a foreign body in a foreign world and felt like an idiot. Then he noticed it. A tiny sprout. From the wet earth next to his right foot. Pale purple, thin as a needle. A night-blooming aster. It hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting for water. 800 years. Ethan looked at the sprout and felt a strange thing. Not joy. Recognition. He knew that feeling. When a system everyone thought was dead suddenly responds to a request. When a server forgotten 10 years ago flashes a green LED.
The aster was too young to use right now. The flower would appear in a few days if watered. Ethan gathered what was there. A white clover root, silver mint leaves. That would be enough for the first dose. Not a complete recipe, but a start. He returned to the house. The kitchen was behind the third door on the left. Small, smoky. A stone stove with a cast-iron grate. On the shelves, 3 pots and not a single spice. In the corner, a sack of rice, half empty. Ethan laid the herbs on the table and began to work. Harin guided his hands. Chop the root, not with a knife, with a stone. A knife will crush the fibers and the juice will escape. A stone tears it gently and preserves the structure. Don't tear the mint leaves. Roll them into a tube and press with your fingers until oil appears. Then put everything in the pot. Water from the well. Don't boil it. Heat slowly until the first bubbles appear. Remove from heat. Let it cool. Strain through a cloth. He found a piece of clean cloth in one of the empty rooms. He strained it. The liquid turned out pale green with the scent of mint and something earthy from the clover. He tasted it. Bitter. Very bitter. Harin suggested that the bitterness was normal. That's how it should be. Ethan stood with the pot in his hands and thought, Sehyun doesn't like bitter things. He didn't know where that certainty came from. Maybe from his body's memory, maybe from the way she grimaced when she drank her own tea that morning. Barely noticeable, for a split second, but he noticed. He went back to the garden. He found a wild plum tree by the well. He picked 3 berries. They were small and sour, but with a dense sweetness inside. He crushed them in the pot. The sweetness softened the bitterness. It didn't take it away, but it made it bearable. He poured the medicine into a cup, the very same cup he'd drunk from that morning, with the remains of chrysanthemum at the bottom. He found Sehyun in the far room. She was sitting on the floor by the window, sewing. No, she was trying to sew. Her hands were shaking too much. The needle wouldn't pierce the fabric. She saw him and flinched. She put down her sewing, folded her hands in her lap. A posture of waiting, a posture of readiness for a blow. Ethan approached and sat across from her at arm's length. He placed the cup between them. He said it was a remedy for weakness, that it was a bit bitter, but he'd added plum to make it milder, that she needed to drink it every morning, that in a week her hands would stop shaking. Sehyun looked at the cup, then at him, then back at the cup. She asked why he was doing this. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Ethan thought for a second. He could have said something nice, could have said she was his wife and it was his duty, could have said he was a good man. Instead, he told the truth.
He said he didn't know this world,
that he needed someone to help him figure things out, that her trembling hands were getting in the way of her sewing, and she clearly loved sewing, that a tool had to work properly. He froze. He realized he'd compared her to a tool. Poor choice of words. He added that he hadn't meant her, but her hands, that her hands were a tool she deserved to use properly, that she has beautiful hands and they shouldn't tremble. Sehyun looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the cup, brought it to her lips, took a sip, winced, but not from bitterness, from surprise. She said it tasted like the tea her grandmother used to brew when Sehyun was little. She said her grandmother also added a plum. Ethan froze. Sehyun's grandmother. A generation that still remembered the old recipes. So the connection hadn't been completely severed. It stretched like a thin thread through the generations, from Herin to her grandmother, and from her grandmother to Sehyun. A small chrysanthemum petal in tea. A drop of plum in bitter medicine. The women of this lineage passed down knowledge not through scrolls and rituals, through gestures of care, through the taste of tea served by trembling hands. Ethan felt something shift in the system. Not a new module, not a new power, an understanding, small and important. This world cannot be saved by a sword, by a cup of tea. Sehyun finished her medicine. She set down the cup. She picked up a needle. Her hands were still trembling, but a little less. She began to sew. Ethan stood up and left. He had a long to-do list. The gate, the roof, the well, rice for 3 days, and somewhere in the abandoned garden, a small purple sprout that needed to be watered in the evening. The next morning, Ethan woke up with pain in every muscle of his body. His arms wouldn't bend. His back wouldn't straighten. He lay on the hard bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and thought that the previous owner of this body had never lifted anything heavier than a calligraphy brush in his entire life. He forced himself to stand up, forced himself to make it to the kitchen. There was a cup on the table, warm. Inside was a pale green medicine, with 3 crushed plums at the bottom. Sehyun had prepared his own medicine for him. He stood there looking at the cup and couldn't understand why it made his throat tighten so much. He drank it, bitter and sweet at the same time. He went out into the yard. The morning was gray, low clouds. The air was damp. First, the gate. The gate leaf lay on the ground and weighed as much as a small car. Solid wood, dark, heavy, forged hinges. 2 out of 3 were broken. Ethan crouched down and examined the structure. Harin was silent. This wasn't her area of expertise. He was on his own with his knowledge. Engineering knowledge, not magical. The gate couldn't be lifted by one person alone. The hinges needed to be replaced or repaired. For that, he needed tools. Blacksmith's tools, which he didn't have. He went to the outbuilding. The roof had caved in, but the walls stood firm. It was dark inside. Ethan found 3 shelves. 2 were empty. The 3rd held dust and rags. He pushed the rags aside and discovered a box, wooden, without a lock. Inside lay tools, old, rusty, but recognizable. A hammer with a split handle, a chisel with a jagged blade, pliers, 3 nails, a coil of rope, a saw with 3 broken teeth. Ethan laid everything out on the ground and looked at it. These weren't a blacksmith's tools. They were a carpenter's tools. They had been in that box for a long time, maybe decades.
maybe longer. He picked up the chisel, and the moment his fingers closed around the handle, the same thing happened as with the herbs yesterday. Warmth at the back of his neck, but different, rougher, heavier.
Like a hand resting on his shoulder. System window, module open. Songhwa Yunso, carpenter. 612 years ago.
Yunso was different. Heron imparted knowledge as gently as water. Yunso struck like a fist. Ethan suddenly saw the gate not through the eyes of an engineer, but through the eyes of the master who built it. Not this specific one, but one just like it, made of the same wood, using the same technique. Yunso knew this wood. He called it an iron heart. It doesn't rot, it doesn't dry out, it doesn't crack, but it's heavy as a rock, and you can only work with it if you know the right points of tension. Ethan walked over to the lying gate leaf. He crouched down. He placed his palm on the wood. Yunso had shown him. Right here and here. Points where the grain runs straight and the panel can be taken apart into 3 pieces without breaking it, then put back together, then put it back in place, alone, without help. Ethan worked for 4 hours. His hands were calloused.
His back was wet with sweat. The hammer with the split handle nearly fell apart twice. He wrapped a rope around the handle and continued. He couldn't fix the hinges. The metal was too rusty, but Yunso knew another way. Wooden hinges, a 600-year-old technique, more reliable than metal if done right. Ethan did it right. Not on the first try. The first hinge cracked. The second one came out crooked. The third one fit perfectly. Yunso grunted with satisfaction, or so Ethan thought he heard. By noon, the gate was in place. Not perfect. It creaked slightly when opened and hung half a centimeter lower than it should. But it was in place. The gate worked. Ethan sat down on the ground by the gate and breathed heavily. A servant with a bucket walked past. He stopped. He looked at the gate. He looked at Ethan. There was something new in his eyes. Not respect, not approval, confusion. Like a man who had seen a dog speak. The servant walked away without saying a word. Ethan smirked. So it wasn't customary here for a master to work with his hands. Fine. One more fact for the map of this world. After lunch, he watered the aster. The sprout had grown 2 inches overnight. The pale purple stems stretched toward the light with a stubbornness that Ethan respected. Then he set to work on the roof of the outbuilding. Yunso helped, but Yunso's knowledge was limited. He was a carpenter, not a builder. He knew wood, but didn't know masonry. The building's roof was tiled. Ethan managed with his engineering skills. Not magical ones, ordinary ones. Load distribution, support points, beams that needed replacing and beams that would still hold. He found planks in the garden, old but sturdy, an iron core, the same wood as the gate. Yunso confirmed it. This wood is everywhere on the estate. The ancestors built to last for centuries. By evening, the structure had a roof. Not pretty, but dry. Ethan stood and looked at his work. Everything was blurring before his eyes from exhaustion. His hands were bloody from calluses, but inside there was a feeling he recognized from a past life, the feeling of a completed build. When, after 3 days of debugging, the system finally boots up and displays a green screen, he turned and saw Sehyun. She was standing at the door of the house, looking at the gate.
at both leaves, standing straight, almost straight. She shifted her gaze to the structure with the new roof, then to Ethan. There was something in her face he couldn't read. Not a smile, not surprise, something deeper. She approached. In her hands she held a rag and a basin of water. She took his hand. Ethan flinched. She began to wash the calluses, gently, so gently that he barely felt the pain, just warm water and her fingers, which were still trembling, but less than yesterday. She said nothing. He said nothing. She washed both his hands, wrapped them in the cloth, took the basin, and left.
Ethan stood with his bandaged hands in the center of the courtyard and thought that if someone in Seoul had washed his hands after a 3-day integration marathon, he probably wouldn't have crashed into that bridge. The thought was silly. He pushed it away. But it came back at night when he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Herin was silent. Yeonso was silent. The system was silent. Only the crack in the ceiling slowly faded into the darkness, and somewhere behind the wall, Sehyun wasn't sleeping either. He could hear her pacing the room, quiet footsteps, back and forth, like someone deep in thought, or like a person afraid to lie down and discover that the morning will bring disappointment. On the 3rd day, a guest arrived. Ethan had been in the garden since morning. He was watering the asters and mapping out the plants in his head when he heard a knock at the gate. The new gate. His gate. The wooden hinges creaked as the servant opened the gate. In the courtyard stood a man in expensive clothes, a dark blue silk robe with silver embroidery along the edges, soft leather boots. Behind him, 2 guards in uniform jackets. The man was young, about 25. His face was smooth. His smile was broad. His eyes were cold. Ethan noticed the discrepancy between the smile and the eyes immediately. The man introduced himself. Kang Do-hyun, manager of commercial affairs for the Karstein House in the eastern district of the capital. He had come on a friendly visit to his new neighbor. Ethan stood there in dirty clothes, with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. The contrast was obvious. Kang Do-hyun looked at him, and his smile widened slightly, like a man whose expectations were being confirmed. Ethan invited him inside. There was no other option. Etiquette. He didn't know the rules of etiquette, but he knew that when a representative of a major company comes to visit, you can't just stand on the doorstep talking. That's the same everywhere. Problem. There was nothing to serve in the house. The tea was bad. There was almost no furniture. The only room that looked decent was the bedroom, and he couldn't take a guest there. Ethan led him into the room by the entrance. It was empty, just a bench against the wall. No table, dust on the floor. Kang Do-hyun sat down on the bench and looked around. The smile hadn't faded. It grew wider. He said he'd heard about Baron Reyes's marriage to the heiress of the Songhwa family. He said it was very touching. He said that the Karstein family had always respected the Songhwa family and that it was a pity that the family's glory days were a thing of the past. Every word was warm. Every word was poison. Ethan recognized this type of conversation. Corporate. When a representative of the acquiring company comes to a small firm and says how much he respects their work, a minute before he names the takeover price. He listened. He gathered information. Kang Do-hyun got down to business. He said that the Karstein family was ready to offer help, financial help, to restore the estate, to hire servants, to provide for its upkeep. in exchange for a small favor. A blood appraiser from the Temple of the Nine Seals wanted to conduct a standard check on the heiress of the Songhwa clan. 4. Just for the record. Ethan felt Sehyun tense up. Not through words, through a chill at the back of his neck. Young-so, too. A heavy, unpleasant chill. Like a warning. Like a hand grabbing his shoulder and pulling him back. Ethan didn't know exactly what was wrong with this request, but 2 dead ancestors inside his head were screaming, no. He said he was grateful for the offer, that he would think about it, that they were settling in right now and weren't ready for visits from appraisers. Kang Do-hyun smiled. He said, of course, that there was now, that he would leave a business card. He placed a small rectangle of white jade on the bench. Name, the Karstein House seal. Address. Then he stood up, bowed, and left. The guards followed him out. The gates closed. Ethan stood in the empty room and looked at the jade card. Sehyun was slowly calming down. The chill at the back of her neck was receding, but it hadn't gone away completely. He found Sehyun in the kitchen. She was standing against the wall, paler than usual, her hands clenched into fists. She had heard everything. The walls were thin. Ethan asked her what a blood assessor was. Sehyun didn't answer for 10 seconds. Then she spoke. Quietly, expressionless, like someone who talks about something painful so many times that the pain has become a habit. A blood assessor is a priest of the Temple of the Nine Seals who measures the depth of a lineage's memory in the heir's blood. A high depth signifies a strong lineage. A low one signifies a withered branch. Status is determined based on the assessment. Inheritance rights, the value of a marriage contract, the right to land. The right to a title, the right to exist. Sehyun was assessed at the age of 7, the lowest score in the history of the Songhwa lineage's measurements. 0. Empty blood, a withered branch. After this assessment, the first suitor rejected her. Then the second. Then the third. Then the proposals stopped. She stood there and spoke all this in an even voice, as if she were talking about someone else's person. Ethan listened and felt something shifting inside him. Not anger. He couldn't allow himself anger. Anger is an emotion. He needed structure. He asked if the assessment could be wrong. Sehyun looked at him the way one looks at a person who asks if water can flow uphill. She said that the temple's assessment was infallible, that it had always been so, that the Temple of the Nine Seals was the highest authority on matters of blood. Ethan thought, if the synergy system had unlocked 2 ancestral modules from the Songhwa lineage, then Sehyun's blood was not empty. It was full. It is sealed. The temple's assessment did not find what was hidden. This is not a measurement error. It is a limitation of the instrument. The assessor measures accessible memory. He cannot see what is sealed. Like a scanner that cannot find files on an encrypted disk partition. The data is there is no access. And someone from the Karstein house wants to conduct a recheck. Why? If they're sure Sehyun is empty, why check again? That means they're not sure. That means they suspect. Or they know. Ethan took the jade card and put it in his pocket. Then he looked at Sehyun. She was standing there, waiting. He said that no appraiser would set foot in their house, that he didn't yet know exactly how to ensure that, but that it was a fact, not a promise. Sehyun looked at him. Her eyes were large, dark. Something stirred in them. Not trust. Hope for trust. A shadow of hope. She nodded. Ethan went out into the courtyard. It was getting dark. He sat down by the well and took a jade card out of his pocket. The seal of House Karstein. Beautiful. Massive. 2 crossed swords above a crown. The house that had destroyed most of the Songhwa clan 1,000 years ago. Ethan didn't know that. Not yet. But Haren knew. And Yoon-so knew. The chill down his spine told him enough. He put the card away. He made a plan in his head for the coming week. Astra, medicine, kitchen repairs, an inventory of the scrolls from Sehyun's dowry, and now one more task. Protection. Not physical, social. He needed a reputation. He needed neighbors who knew his name. He needed people who would know that a man lived at the Reyes Songhwa estate, not an empty space. Because an empty space could be taken without consequences. A man could not. That was the same in any world. He went to water the aster. The sprout was already a finger's height. The first leaf had emerged on the stem. On the 5th day, Ethan opened the dowry. 3 chests stood in the far room, covered with gray cloth. Ethan pulled back the cloth and felt how Haren and Yoon-song both leaned forward. 2 dead ancestors inside his head reached for these chests like children for presents. The first chest. Scrolls. Many scrolls. The paper was yellow and brittle. The ink was faded. Ethan unrolled the top one. Recipes, herbal mixtures, teas, ointments, tinctures. Haren rejoiced. Warmth spread in waves across the back of her neck. These were her notes. Not all of them, but some. Transcribed by one of her descendants hundreds of years after her death. Inaccurate, with errors, but the essence remained. Ethan read, and Haren listened. The proportions are wrong here. The herbs are mixed up here. An extra ingredient has been added here that wasn't in the original. He made notes in pencil in the margins. No, there was no pencil. He found a charred stick in the kitchen and wrote with it. Clumsy letters in the margins of the old scrolls. The second chest. Tools. Broken. Ethan laid them out on the floor, and Yoon-song commented on each one. A chisel. Good steel. Sharpen it and it'll work. A plane. The handle is rotten, but the blade is intact. A set of drill bits. 3 out of 5 are intact. A chisel with a crack in the heel. Dangerous to work with, might split, but if you wrap it in wire, it'll hold up. Under the tools at the bottom lay a wooden case. Inside, a calligraphy set. 3 brushes, a stone inkstone, a block of ink. Yoon-so fell silent. Haren fell silent. Their silences were different. Yoon-so simply wasn't interested in calligraphy. Haren was silent because she knew whose set it was, but the knowledge hadn't come. The module hadn't opened. Ethan sensed a boundary, the edge of the map, a territory that exists but is inaccessible. He put the calligraphy set back in its case. It would open later, or maybe not. The third chest. Clothes. Old. Silk that had once been white but had now turned ivory. 2 dresses, 1 men's suit. An embroidered sash. The embroidery depicted chrysanthemums. Ethan held the sash and looked at the flowers. Chrysanthemums everywhere. In Sehyun's tea. On the sash from the dowry. It's no coincidence. It's a symbol of the family. A quiet, stubborn flower that blooms when all the others have already died. He carried the clothes to Sehyun's room and set them on the threshold. He didn't go in.
He knocked and left. An hour later, he returned to the dowry and sat down among the scrolls. Sehyun was helping to organize them. 23 recipes for herbal mixtures, 14 of them work after adjustments. 6 require ingredients not found in the garden. 3 are completely lost. Of the 14 that work, 5 are medicines, for weakness, for insomnia, for joint pain, for colds, for upset stomachs. Simple things, everyday matters, but in a world where aristocrats rely on complex blood rituals and pay for them in gold, a simple herbal remedy for 3 coins would be in demand.
Ethan saw a niche. He had spent 10 years in business. He knew what an untapped market segment looked like. Aristocratic medicine for aristocrats. And what about the servants? For ordinary townspeople? For those who can't pay a temple priest for treatment? For them, nothing. Empty. That was his niche. But a workshop needs resources. It needs a reputation. It needs a first customer. He stepped out into the courtyard. The aster had bloomed in 5 days. A small purple flower with 6 petals. Ethan plucked it carefully and carried it to the kitchen. Now the recipe was complete. White clover root, silver mint leaf, night aster flower. He prepared the medicine according to Sehyun's complete recipe, slowly, carefully. Water temperature, steeping time, order of addition. The aster last. Its petals must be placed in hot but not boiling water and kept in exactly as long as it takes to count to 20. Then remove. If left in too long, the medicine will become a sleeping potion. If left in too short a time, it won't work. He counted. 1, 2, 20. He removed them. The liquid became clear with a slight violet tint. The scent was subtle, floral, without bitterness. The aster had removed the bitterness. Hedda knew this. Of course she knew. The aster was the key ingredient, not because it was stronger than the other herbs, but because it made the medicine mild, pleasant, drinkable. A medicine you want to drink. No need to force yourself. Ethan poured the medicine into 2 cups. He took one to Sehyun. He left the second in the kitchen. For himself. His body was weak too, and he needed treatment too. Sehyun took the cup with both hands. She brought it to her face. She inhaled the scent, opened her eyes. Something had changed in her face. Ethan couldn't tell exactly what. She said it smelled like her grandmother's garden, that she thought she'd dreamed up that scent, that she thought it didn't exist. She took a sip. Her hands weren't shaking. Ethan noticed it before she did. Sehyun's hands weren't shaking. 5 days. 5 doses of the incomplete medicine, and her hands had stopped shaking. Sehyun set the cup down. She looked at her hands. She raised them in front of her. Her fingers were steady, unmoving. She looked at her fingers as if she were seeing them for the first time. Then she turned to Ethan and smiled. Not fully, with half her face. The right corner of her mouth lifted. The left hadn't made up its mind yet. A half smile. The first one. Ethan nodded, calmly, as if it were normal, as if it were nothing special. But inside, the system flashed a brief notification that he didn't even bother to read. He already knew. Something had shifted. Something big. He left the room and went to the kitchen. He drank his cup. He sat down on the floor, leaned against the wall,
closed his eyes. Heron and Yun-so were quiet, satisfied, like masters who see that their student is on the right path. Ethan sat and thought. 5 days.
The gate is fixed. The roof is repaired. The medicine works. The dowry has been sorted out. 14 recipes, a set of tools, and a wife who smiled with half her face. Now the next step. He needs money. The rice will run out in 2 days. The sack is almost empty. The servants are working because they have nowhere else to go, but if he doesn't pay them, they'll leave, and he'll be left alone with Sehyun in a house that's still half uninhabitable. He needs his first client, someone who needs medicine that he can make, someone who will pay. Not much, enough to buy rice and salt and maybe oil for the lamps, because it gets dark early in the evenings. In the morning, he'll go to the market. Not to sell yet. First, to watch, to listen, to understand the prices, to understand the demand, to understand who buys what and for how much. Data. Always start with data. He opened his eyes. It was getting dark outside the window. A sound came from Sehyun's room, quiet, rhythmic. She was sewing, with hands that no longer trembled. Ethan smiled. He stood up. He went to close the gate for the night. The wooden hinges creaked. The gate panels closed smoothly. He slid the bolt into place. The bolt was old and rusty, but held fast. The house was locked. His wife was sewing. The asters were blooming. Tomorrow was market day. Enough for 1 day. The market in the eastern quarter began 2 turns from the estate. Ethan went out at dawn. His clothes were clean but shabby, a simple gray robe, the only one without holes. He walked down a narrow street between the stone walls of strangers' houses and looked around. The capital was vast. Even the eastern quarter, which was considered a poor suburb, was the size of a small district in Seoul. 2-story houses, stone walls, tile roofs. The streets were paved, but the stones were crooked and grass grew between them. People. Lots of people. Servants with baskets, merchants with carts, guards in leather jackets with crests on their shoulders, women in long dresses with their heads covered, children barefoot and grubby. Ethan walked and counted. 3 apothecaries on the front row of the market. All 3 sell dried herbs and powders in paper bags. The prices are written in chalk on small boards. High. Very high. A bunch of dried mint costs as much as a sack of rice. Ethan stopped at the first apothecary and pretended to examine the goods. The apothecary was a fat man with a red nose. He looked at Ethan's clothes and lost interest. Ethan noticed this. They don't serve poor customers here. Makes sense. Herbs are expensive because they're gathered in the mountains and brought from far away. No one uses local plants. Why? Because local plants aren't listed in the Temple of the 9 Seals catalog, and the temple's catalog is the only authority in medicine. If it's not in the catalog, it's not medicine. Ethan smiled to himself. A classic monopoly, a certified supplier, a closed market. He walked on. The second row of the market, food, rice, flour, oil, vegetables, meat on hooks, fish in wooden trays. Prices are lower, more affordable, but still not for an empty pocket. Ethan had 3 copper coins in his pocket, all he'd found in the bedroom dresser, a legacy from the body's previous owner. For 3 coins you can buy 2 pounds of rice, or a pound of salt, or a small bottle of oil.
Not everything at once, just one thing. He chose the rice. 2 measures in a canvas bag. The rice seller was a thin old man with a long beard. He weighed the rice on a hand scale and looked at Ethan with that expression Ethan was already beginning to recognize, a mixture of pity and contempt. A poor aristocrat. Worse than just a poor person, because a poor person isn't obligated to live up to a standard, but a poor aristocrat is a walking insult to his class. Ethan took the rice and headed back. He stopped along the way.
A woman was sitting against the wall of one of the houses. Not young, about 50. Her clothes were nice but worn. A dress that had once been expensive was now frayed at the elbows. She was sitting on a stone bench, clutching her right arm. Her face was ashen. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing heavily. A girl of about 10 stood nearby, tugging at her sleeve. The girl was urging her to get up. The woman didn't respond. Ethan stopped. It wasn't his business. He had rice in his hands and a wife at home and a gate that needed tightening and asters to water. It wasn't his business. Hodden disagreed. The warmth at the back of his neck grew insistent, almost hot. Ethan walked over. He crouched down beside her. He looked at the woman. A gray face, sweat on her forehead. Her right arm pressed against her chest. Her fingers were bluish. Hodden prompted him. Blood stagnation in the right arm, not the heart. A constriction of a vessel in the shoulder, most likely from carrying heavy loads on one side for a long time. Ethan asked the girl how long her mother had been sitting like that. The girl said it wasn't her mother, but a lady, that she was a maid, that the lady had gone to the market and suddenly grabbed her arm and sat down, that she didn't know what to do. Ethan looked at the woman. He asked if he could examine her arm. The woman opened her eyes, clouded with pain. She nodded. Ethan took her right hand, gently. Her fingers were cold. The pulse at her wrist was weak. He placed his other hand on her shoulder. He found the spot. Heron had shown him, under the collarbone, between the muscle and the bone, a small knot, a constriction. He pressed, not hard, exactly. The woman flinched. She gasped, and 3 seconds later, the color of her fingers began to change, from bluish to pink. The blood was flowing. The woman exhaled. She opened her eyes normally. She looked at her hand. She wiggled her fingers. Then she looked at Ethan. She asked who he was. He said he was Baron Reyes, from the estate in the eastern quarter. The woman looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she said she was Baroness Villard, that she lived 3 streets away, that she had a daughter, and that she was grateful. Ethan nodded. He helped her to her feet. She left, leaning on a maid, slowly, but the fingers of her right hand were pink. Ethan watched her go and thought that sometimes the first client finds you on their own. He returned to the estate. Sehyun met him at the gate. She wasn't waiting. She just happened to be nearby. She saw the sack of rice, and something in her face changed. Relief. She'd been afraid he wouldn't come back, that he'd go to the market and not return. Ethan put the rice in the kitchen. He told Sehyun about the market, about the prices of herbs, about how local plants aren't used because they aren't in the temple's catalog, about his idea. Herbal blends from the garden, based on Herin's recipes, cheap, affordable, for those who can't pay the priests. Sehyun listened. Then she said it was dangerous, that the temple doesn't tolerate those who sell medicines without its seal. that there had been cases where people were thrown into debtor's prison for selling uncertified herbs. Ethan thought, she's right. You can't sell it directly. You need a workaround. Not medicine. Tea. Herbal tea. A beverage. It doesn't cure. It's just tasty. Just healthy. It just relieves fatigue and improves sleep. It's not medicine. It's cooking. The temple doesn't control cooking. Sehyun looked at him. The right corner of her mouth twitched. That same half-smile. She said it was clever. Ethan said it wasn't cleverness but a reclassification of the product. In Seoul, they did this every day. He spent the rest of the day poring over scrolls, picking out recipes. Not all of them worked. He needed ones that looked and smelled like tea, that were pleasant to drink, that didn't require rare ingredients. 5 recipes. A blend for sleep. A blend for alertness. A blend for headaches. A blend for digestion. A blend for warmth in cold weather. Each of the 5 can be made from what grows in the garden. Each has been tested by Sehyun. Each works. He began drying the herbs. He spread them out on cloth in the outbuilding, on the new roof, under which it is now dry. Sehyun helped, silently, without asking. She came and began laying out the leaves in rows. Her hands were steady, her fingers precise. She knew how to work with her hands. It was just that before, her hands wouldn't obey her. Now they did. They worked side by side until dark. They said almost nothing. Sometimes Ethan named a herb. Sehyun nodded. Sometimes Sehyun showed him a plant he hadn't recognized. Sehyun recognized it through her fingers, through the scent on her palms. The system flashed in the evening as he was falling asleep, a brief notification. Synergy level increased. But the new module didn't open. It just got a little warmer at the back of his neck. Sehyun and Yun-so grew a little closer, a little clearer, like a bond that strengthens not from a breakthrough, but from daily use. 3 days later, Baroness Villard sent a maid, that very same girl from the market. The girl brought a note and a basket. In the basket were eggs, a piece of smoked meat, and a small bag of salt. The note was short. The Baroness thanked him for his help and said her hand no longer hurt, and a postscript. Her daughter wanted to pay a visit if Baron Reyes didn't mind. Ethan didn't mind. The eggs and meat were his first proper meal in a week. Sehyun made breakfast, simple, rice with eggs and thin slices of meat. Ethan ate and thought that never in his life, in this one or the last, had he eaten anything tastier. Hunger is the best seasoning. It's a cliché, but clichés become revelations when you live them. The Baroness's daughter arrived after noon, on horseback, alone. No servants, no guards, her red hair pulled back into a tight bun, a men's shirt, riding pants, knee-high boots. A short sword and a worn scabbard hung from her belt. She dismounted at the gate and tied her horse to a post. She looked at the gate, at the new wooden hinges. She ran her finger along the wood. Then she entered the courtyard. Ethan met her by the well. She stopped 3 paces away. She looked at him. Her eyes were green and straight as 2 blades. She said her name was Iris Vellard, that her mother had told her how he had helped, that she hadn't come to thank him, that she had business. Ethan nodded. He offered to invite her inside. Iris shook her head. She said she didn't need politeness, that she needed a healer. She spoke in short sentences,
like someone who's used to choosing their words carefully because every word carries a decision. Her father is dying, Baron Vellard. 3 years ago, he fell ill. It started with weakness, then pain, then a coughing up of blood.
The healers from the temple examined him twice. The first time they said the bloodline's memory was fading and they were powerless. The second time they didn't come. She took her father to private doctors. 5 different ones. Each took gold and gave powders that didn't help. She sold the family sword, sold her mother's silver, sold 2 of the 3 horses. One remained, the one standing at the gate. There's no more money. Her father coughs up blood every morning. She asked if Ethan could help. His voice was steady, his face was stony, but the fingers of his right hand were gripping the sword hilt so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Ethan thought. He wasn't a doctor. He was an engineer with access to the knowledge of an 800-year-old of herbalists. Coughing up blood is serious. It's not a simple vascular clot on the street. Harun responded, calmly, without fanfare, with that steady warmth that comes when a master takes on a difficult task. She knew lung diseases. Not all of them, but many. And she knew that without an examination, a diagnosis couldn't be made. Ethan said he needed to see his father. Iris nodded, briefly. She was expecting a refusal. She'd been getting refusals for 3 years. The nod was the only thing she could allow herself to do without holding back. They walked, 3 blocks. Iris led the horse behind her. She was silent. Ethan was silent too. The Vellard house was larger than the Songhwa estate, 2 stories, stone, but just as dilapidated. The plaster was peeling, the windows on the 2nd floor were boarded up. The garden had been turned into a vegetable patch, rows of cabbage and onions between ornamental trees. Survival. Ethan recognized it. Baron Vellard lay on the 2nd floor in a room with shuttered windows. The air inside was heavy, sweetish, a familiar smell. The one Ethan had sensed on the first day, the smell of illness. The Baron had been a large man, broad shoulders, large hands, but now all of that was covered in skin stretched over nothing but bone. A skeleton under the blanket. His face was yellow. His eyes were sunken. He was wheezing. Every breath came with effort. On a small table nearby stood vials of powders, 5 different ones. Ethan picked up each one and sniffed it. Harun identified them. The first one was useless, chalk and fragrance. The second one was useless, dried root with no medicinal properties. The third one was dangerous, a stimulant that speeds up the heart. For a dying man, it's poison. The 4th and 5th were water with food coloring. 5 charlatans. 5 vials of deception. Ethan put the vials back. He looked at the Baron. He asked him to open his mouth. The Baron opened it. His tongue was pale with a gray coating. Harun pointed it out. Look at his nails. Ethan took the Baron's hand. The nails were concave, spoon-shaped. Harun nodded. Not the lungs. Blood. The disease isn't in the lungs, but in the blood. The blood isn't carrying enough oxygen. The lungs are working, but the body is suffocating. Coughing up blood is the consequence, not the cause. Ethan let go of his hand. He turned to Iris. She was standing by the door, looking at him, waiting. He said that her father wasn't dying, that he'd been treated incorrectly, that the illness was in the blood, not the lungs, that he could help, that it would take time, 2 weeks at least. And herbs. Lots of herbs. Some of which aren't in his garden. Iris looked at him, and a battle was raging on her face. Hope and the fear of hope. 3 years of disappointments. 3 years of quacks. And now here was another person saying he could help. She asked what the price was. Ethan said there was no price, that she had already paid, with meat and eggs and salt. Iris flinched. She said it was ridiculous, that she wouldn't accept charity. Ethan said it wasn't charity, that he needed help, that he didn't have money for herbs that weren't in the garden, that if she helped him get 3 plants from the mountainside north of town, he'd consider the payment complete. Iris looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Once. Briefly, like a person signing a contract. The next morning she brought the herbs, 3 bundles tied with rough rope, iron birch root, mountain nettle leaf, bloodroot flower. Bloodroot. Harin spoke of it with respect. A rare plant. It grows only on slopes above 1,000 meters. Its sap contains a substance that causes the blood to produce more red blood cells. Just what he needed. Ethan prepared the medicine all day. Harin supervised. This recipe was more complicated. 12 steps. Precise temperatures, precise timing, precise proportions. One mistake and the medicine would become poison. He made no mistakes. By evening, the pot contained a thick, dark red liquid with the smell of iron and earth. Unpleasant, bitter. He added a plum. It became tolerable. He took the first dose to the Baron. The Baron drank it. He grimaced. He fell asleep 10 minutes later. His breathing evened out. The wheezing didn't go away, but it grew quieter. Iris stood by her father's bed and looked at his face. She wasn't crying. She had forgotten how to cry 3 years ago. But something in her eyes was wet. She turned to Ethan, opened her mouth, closed it, couldn't say thank you, didn't know how. Ethan didn't wait. He left. He went home. At the estate, Sehyun was drying herbs for tea blends, 5 varieties laid out in neat rows on a clean cloth, small paper bags stacked in a pile. She had made the bags from old scrolls, the ones that were empty, blank sheets from her dowry. Ethan looked at the neat rows of herbs and paper bags and thought that this quiet, pale girl had organized the production while he was away treating someone else's father, without asking, without being told. She saw for herself what was needed. She did it herself. She looked up, asked if everything was all right. Ethan said yes. That tomorrow they would start packing. That in 2 days they would have stock. Sehyun nodded and smiled, with half her face again, but this time a little more. The left corner of her mouth twitched too. The first sale happened on the 9th day. Ethan carried a wooden tray with 10 paper bags to the market, 5 varieties, 2 bags of each. On each bag, Sehyun had drawn a chrysanthemum, a small one, neat, in ink from a calligraphy set. He hadn't asked her to. She did it on her own. The chrysanthemum became their symbol. Ethan didn't try to find a spot among the merchants. He stood by the wall across the street from the apothecaries. Not a competitor, a parallel. He wasn't selling medicine. He was selling tea. On a tray lay a small board with an inscription, "Herbal teas from the Songhwa estate, for a good night's sleep, for a lively morning, for a calm stomach." For the first hour,
No one approached, nor for the second. People watched, some with curiosity, most without interest.
A poor aristocrat peddling at the market. A disgrace. A spectacle, but no reason to buy. Ethan stood and waited. He knew that the first customer is the hardest, always, in any business, because the first customer isn't buying a product, they're buying trust, and you can't put trust on a tray. An hour later, an old woman approached, small, hunchbacked, with a cane. She looked at the bags, sniffed one, asked how much. Ethan named the price, 1 copper coin per bag, 10 times cheaper than the apothecary's dried mint. The old woman looked at him suspiciously, asked why it was so cheap. Ethan said the herbs were from his own garden, that he didn't have to pay for delivery from the mountains, that big and his family is small. The old woman thought for a minute. Then she bought 1 packet, a sleep blend. 1 copper coin landed on the tray. Ethan thanked her. The old woman left. The second sale happened half an hour later. A young woman with a child in her arms. She bought a digestive blend. The third one an hour after that. A middle-aged man of middle age, a blend for energy. By evening, 7 copper coins lay on the tray. 3 packets remained unsold. 2 blends for warmth, 1 for headaches. Ethan walked home and counted. 7 coins. With them, he could buy 4 measures of rice, or 2 measures of rice in oil for the lamps, or rice in salt and cheap vegetables. Not wealth, but progress. A vector upward, not downward. At home, Sehyun was waiting with dinner. Rice with stewed vegetables from the garden she had planted where the dead flower bed had been by the south wall. Ethan didn't know when she'd managed it. 3 beds, onions, carrots, something resembling radishes. She had planted the garden while he was at the market. They ate in silence. Then Ethan placed 7 coins on the table. Sehyun looked at them. 7 small copper discs. She picked one up, turned it over in her fingers, put it back. Said it was the first money she'd ever earned in her life. Because these were her herbs, her garden, her drawing on the bags.
Ethan nodded, said it was their money, hers and his. Sehyun lowered her eyes, but the corners of her mouth turned up, both of them. The next day, Ethan went to the market again. 15 bags. Sehyun packed them until dawn, a chrysanthemum on each one. He sold 12. 3 days later, a line began to form in front of him. A small one, 5 or 6 people, but a line nonetheless. The old woman from the first day came back. She said she'd slept like a baby for the first time in 2 years. She bought 3 bags, for herself, for her neighbor, and for her daughter. Word of mouth, the oldest marketing tool. It works the same in every world. On the 5th day of trading, what Ethan had both hoped for and feared happened. A man in a uniform jacket with an emblem on his shoulder approached his spot by the wall. Not a guard, an inspector. A thin man with a narrow face and a folder under his arm. He looked at the tray.
He looked at the bags.
He opened one. He sniffed it. He asked if the product had the temple's seal. Ethan said that a seal wasn't required, that it wasn't medicine, that it was a tea blend, a food product. The inspector stared at him blankly. Then he said that any product containing medicinal herbs must have the temple's approval, that the herbs listed on the packages were included in the catalog of controlled plants, that he was required to confiscate the goods. Ethan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He asked which specific edition of the catalog listed these herbs. The inspector froze. He hadn't expected the question. Ethan continued. He said that silver mint had been removed from the catalog of controlled plants 17 years ago during a classification review when the temple's archivist was replaced. That white clover had never been included in the catalog because it grows everywhere and is not rare.
That night, aster is listed as an ornamental plant, not a medicinal one. The inspector opened the folder. He leafed through it. Ethan waited. He didn't know if what he'd said was true. Heron had tipped him off about silver mint. He'd figured out the clover and aster part from logic. Cheap, common plants aren't controlled. It's economics, not the law. But it sounded convincing. The inspector closed the folder. He looked at Ethan. He said he would check it out, that if the information wasn't confirmed, he would return with a citation. He turned and left. Ethan stood there, feeling his heart pound in his throat. A bluff. A pure bluff. If the inspector checked and found that silver mint was still in the catalog, the trade would end. That evening he told Sehyun. She listened. Then she went into the room with her dowry. She returned half an hour later with a scroll, an old one, very old. The paper was almost falling apart. On the scroll was a list of plants. With the seal of the Temple of the Nine Seals, the date, 230 years ago. It was an old catalog, incomplete, but in it, silver mint was listed as uncontrolled. 230 years ago, it wasn't in the catalog. Then it was. Then maybe it was removed, or maybe not. But they have a document, an old one, but bearing the temple's seal. Ethan looked at Sehyun. She stood with the scroll in her hands and, for the first time, looked him in the eyes without looking away. There was something new in her eyes. Not a smile, not hope. Engagement. She was in the game, not an observer, a participant. Ethan took the scroll. He said she had saved their trade. Sehyun lowered her eyes, but not right away. A second later, a small victory. Baron Villard sat up in bed on the 12th day of his treatment. Iris stood by the door and watched as her father, for the first time in a year, raised his back without the help of pillows. A large man with sunken cheeks and yellow skin, but sitting up, breathing without wheezing. He looked at his hands, clenched his fists, unclenched them. His nails were still concave, but pinker than they had been. The blood was circulating, slowly, but it was circulating. Ethan stood by the window and said nothing. Heron was silent too. The satisfied silence of a master who sees the result. The Baron turned to Ethan, asked who he was. Not his name. He knew the name, the essence. Who was this man who had come to his house and restored his ability to sit? Ethan told the truth. He said he was Songhwa Sehyun's husband, that he used the old recipes of the Songhwa clan, that these recipes worked. The Baron was silent for a minute. Then he said he had known Sehyun's grandfather a long time ago, when he was young, that the grandfather had been a quiet man who grew herbs and never spoke of blood or heritage, that he had been considered an eccentric, that when he died, no one came to the funeral except Villard himself. Ethan listened. Every word was a piece of the map. Sehyun's grandfather knew the recipes. He passed them down through the dowry, not through teaching, through objects, scrolls in a chest, herbs in the garden, a calligraphy set.
He hid the legacy in objects because passing it on directly was impossible. The blood seal wouldn't allow it. But the seal didn't extend to paper and wood and dry petals. Grandfather found a loophole, like an engineer circumventing the system's limitations. Ethan smiled to himself. They were alike. He and this dead old man he'd never seen. Iris walked him to the gate. She walked beside him. She was silent. She stopped at the gate. Ethan turned to her. She looked at him with that direct green gaze that couldn't pretend. She said she owed him, that she was paying her debts, that if he needed help of any kind, she would come. Ethan nodded. He said he'd remember. Iris nodded back.
She turned and went into the house. She didn't look back. On the way to the estate, Ethan thought about how he now had an ally. One. A real one, not bought, earned. Iris Villard. A girl with a sword and a pride that wouldn't let her say thank you, but who would offer her life to pay a debt. A problem awaited him at home. The servant with the bucket. The very same one who had been laughing behind the door on the first day. He was standing in the courtyard with his belongings, a small bundle, a shirt, a pair of shoes. He said he was leaving, that he wasn't being paid, that he'd been working for food for 2 months, that he'd been offered a job at a merchant's house 2 blocks away, that he was leaving now. Ethan looked at him. The servant didn't meet his gaze. He expected to be held back or scolded. Ethan did neither. He asked his name. The servant was surprised. He said his name was Pak. Ethan nodded. He said he understood, that he couldn't pay him right now, That if Pak wanted to come back in a month, he'd have a place and a salary. Pak looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. He picked up his bundle and left. The woman remained. The maid. Her name was Mrs. One. Ethan only found this out now. 12 days in the same house, and he didn't know the name of the person who cooked his rice. That was bad. Mrs. One was different. She didn't talk about leaving. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she had known Sehyun since childhood. She had been Sehyun's nanny before becoming a maid. She told Ethan this that evening when he asked. She said she'd seen Mrs. Sehyun eat normally for the first time in years, that she'd seen her hands stop trembling, that this was enough to stay. Ethan sat in the kitchen and listened to Mrs. One. She talked about Sehyun, about her childhood, about how little Sehyun loved to sit play in the garden and talk to the flowers, About how she sang quiet songs when she thought no one could hear her. About how, after the blood test at age 7, she stopped singing. Completely. As if her voice had been taken away along with her dignity. Ethan listened. Every word fell into the system and found its place. Sehyun's map was becoming more detailed, more precise, more vivid. Mrs. Wan said one more thing, quietly, glancing toward the door. She said that Sehyun had a sister, a younger one, named Mirae, that Mirae had disappeared 10 years ago, that they said she had died. But Mrs. Wan doesn't believe it, because no one saw the body. Because on the night Mirae disappeared, people from a distant temple came to the estate. 2 monks in gray robes. They arrived at night and left before dawn, and Mirae left with them. Mrs. Wan saw it from the kitchen window. She hadn't told anyone for 10 years. Ethan looked at her. He asked why she was telling him now.
Mrs. Wan looked him in the eyes. For the first time in 12 days,
She said it was because he was the first person to water the flowers in Mrs. Sehyun's garden instead of chopping them down for firewood. Ethan sat in the dark kitchen after Mrs. Wan had gone to bed.
Sehyun's sister, alive, hidden in the temple. 10 years. Why? Who are these monks? Why did they take the child? Why did the family decide she was dead? Or did they know she wasn't dead and keep quiet? The questions multiplied. Every answer spawned 3 new questions. As always happens when you start digging into the architecture of the old system, layer by layer, and the deeper you go, the more you realize you understand nothing. He stood up. He went out into the courtyard. The night was clear. The stars here were different. Not his stars, not his sky. He stood there, looking up, thinking about the little girl who had been taken from her home 10 years ago, about Sehyun, who had lost her sister and her voice in a single year, about the blood seal that hides the legacy,
About the Karstein house that fears this legacy. He returned to the house.
He lay down. He closed his eyes. Herin and Yunsol were silent, but the silence was warm, like the presence of people sitting nearby in the dark and not leaving. Ethan didn't tell Sehyun about his sister, not right away. He needed facts, not guesswork. False hope is worse than no hope at all. He knew that. Instead, he focused on what he could control. Business. In 3 weeks, the tea workshop had reached a steady income. 30 bags a day, 5 varieties, regular customers. The old woman brought a neighbor on the very first day. The neighbor brought her sister. The sister brought her husband. The husband brought his colleagues. The network was growing. A stream of copper flowed in a thin but steady trickle. Ethan bought enough rice to last a month. He bought lamp oil. He bought salt and flour and beans and a bundle of dried fish. He bought fabric for new bags because the rolls had run out.
He bought 3 skeins of rope and nails. He paid Mrs. Wan 2 months' wages. She looked at the coins in her palm, and her chin trembled. But she was one of those people who don't cry in front of their employers. She bowed and left. Sehyun worked. Every day. No days off. No complaints. She sorted herbs. She drew chrysanthemums on the bags. She dried new batches. She tended the garden. Ethan had shown her how to water the night aster, and she watered it every evening. The aster had grown. 3 stems, then 5, then a whole bush. Purple flowers by the ruined fountain, a small purple burst amid the gray stone. Her hands didn't tremble, not at all. The medicine was working. She drank the full dose with the aster every morning. Her complexion changed. The pallor was gone. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks. She was still quiet. She still lowered her eyes, but less often, and not for long, like a person learning to look at the world anew. On the 21st day, Ethan found the moment. Evening. The kitchen. Dinner. Mrs. Wan had gone to her room, just the 2 of them.
He said he'd heard about her sister. Sehyun froze. Her chopsticks stopped halfway to her mouth. She put them back down, slowly. Her face turned white. That white it had been on the first day. She asked who had told him. Ethan said Mrs. Wan. Sehyun was silent for 30 seconds. Ethan counted. Then she spoke, in a voice that was lower than usual, deeper. She said that Mirae had died when she was 7, that she had fallen ill and died, that there was no body because, according to family tradition, the body had been cremated at dawn, that she remembered the ashes, that she remembered the smell. Ethan listened. Then he said quietly that Mrs. Wan had seen 2 monks take the girl away at night, that there was no body because there had been no death. Sehyun looked at him. Something dark and heavy was rising in her eyes, like water behind a dam. 10 years. For 10 years she had thought her sister was dead.
10 years she had carried that weight. And now a man she had known for 3 weeks was telling her that it might all be a lie. She stood up. She walked out of the kitchen. Ethan didn't follow her. He gave her space. He heard her walking around the yard, quick steps, then slow ones. Then she stopped. Silence. 5 minutes of silence. Then she came back, sat down in her seat. She picked up her chopsticks. Her hands weren't shaking. Her voice was steady. She said that if Meyer was alive, the Temple of the Scarlet Seal had taken her, a distant temple in the mountains to the north, a temple that takes in children with anomalous blood, children who need to be hidden or protected or isolated. She didn't know which option. She said that 7 years old, when they tested Meyer's blood, she didn't get a 0. She got a number the evaluator refused to say out loud. He wrote it down on paper, showed it to her father. Her father turned pale. They burned the paper. A week later, Meyer disappeared. Ethan listened, and the system in his head organized the data into a diagram. Sehyun got a 0. Mirae got a number that cannot be spoken. One sister is empty, the other is overflowing. The same blood, the same lineage, 2 opposite results. This is no coincidence. This is distribution. The seal on the blood of the Songhwa lineage did not erase the legacy, it redirected it, from one vessel to another. Sehyun was empty because all her legacy had gone to Mirae, or vice versa. Or the seal worked in a more complex way than he thought. He asked if Sehyun knew exactly where the Temple of the Scarlet Seal was located. She said it was in the Taebaek Mountains, a 3-day journey north. Itan nodded. A 3-day journey. He had no horse, no money for the road, no weapons for traveling through the wild lands. But he had Iris, with a horse and a sword, and a debt she wanted to repay. He didn't say that out loud. Not now. Sehyun was already on the edge. He could see it in her shoulders, tense, Raised, like someone holding up a wall that's about to collapse. He said they would find Meyer. Not a promise, a fact, like with the blood appraiser. Sehyun looked at him. In her eyes was that very water behind the dam, heavy, dark, but the dam held. She nodded, stood up, cleared the dishes, left. Ethan sat alone in the kitchen and thought. The Temple of the Scarlet Seal, House Carstane, the Seal of Blood, appraisers, monks, a dead sister who is alive, a legacy that hadn't vanished but had been redistributed. The scheme was getting more complicated, but it was there. There were connections. There was logic, just like in any system, no matter how convoluted. He pulled Kang Do-hyun's jade card out of his pocket, turned it over in his fingers.
The House of Karstein wanted to assess Sehyun. Why, if she's empty? Because they know or suspect that it isn't empty. Because they know or suspect that the seal exists, and they fear what will happen if the seal is removed.
Because 1,000 years ago, they destroyed the Songhwa clan precisely what was inside it. He placed the card on the table. In the morning, he would speak with Iris. He would suggest a trip north, to the mountains, to the temple, to find the girl they had hidden 10 years ago. But first, he needed to make sure the estate would be safe while he was away. He needed to make sure Sehyun wasn't left alone. He needed someone to be there with her. Mrs. Wan. Baron Villard, if he recovers. The neighbors. The clients. A small network of people who know that the Reyes Songhwa estate is inhabited, not just an empty place. He began to draw up a plan, point by point, like a technical assignment, like specifications for deploying a system. Every step must be completed before he leaves. Every link must be in place. He fell asleep at the table, his head in his hands, a jade card under his palm. And he did not dream of the past or the future. He dreamed of a purple flower growing from a crack in the stone, unaware that it should not be growing there. The market in the eastern quarter was waking up before dawn. Ethan left the estate when the sky was still gray and the streets empty. In his hands, a wooden tray. On the tray, 10 paper bags, 5 varieties, 2 bags each. On each bag, a chrysanthemum drawn in ink. Sehyun had been drawing until late at night. He hadn't asked her to. She saw the empty bags, took a brush from the calligraphy set, and began. Each flower was different from the others, not a stamp, a living drawing. Ethan noticed this only in the morning when he was laying out the bags. 10 chrysanthemums, 10 different ones. He walked down the street and thought that this quiet girl had put more soul into those paper bags than any other artist puts into a painting. The market began just past the second turn, a long street between stone houses, stalls with awnings. Merchants were laying out their wares. Servants with baskets hurried to get in line at the butcher's. Ethan walked past 3 apothecaries on the first row. All 3 sold dried herbs and powders, prices on little boards. High. A bunch of mint cost as much as a sack of rice. A monopoly of the Temple of the 9 Seals. He didn't set up next to them. He chose a spot across the street. By the wall between the potter's stall and the rope-maker's stall, a quiet corner, not a competitor, a parallel. He placed his tray on an upside-down crate. He placed a small board next to it. On the board, he wrote with a charred stick, "Herbal teas from the Songhwa estate. For sleep, for energy, for the stomach, for the head, for warmth. Price, 1 copper coin, 10 times cheaper than the apothecary's mint." For the first hour, no one approached. People walked by, some glanced sideways. A poor aristocrat selling at the market, a spectacle, not merchandise. Ethan stood and waited. He knew the rule. The first customer is the hardest, always. In any business, in any world. As the second hour drew to a close, an old woman approached, small, hunchbacked, with a cane. She looked at the packets, took one, brought it to her nose, sniffed through the paper, looked at Ethan. She asked what it was. He said it was tea for a good night's sleep, silver mint and evening aster and white clover root, from his own garden.
The old woman asked why it was so cheap. Ethan said the garden was big and the family was small. The old woman looked at him suspiciously. Then she looked at the chrysanthemum on the bag. She ran her finger over the drawing. She asked who drew it. Ethan said his wife. The old woman snorted. She placed a copper coin on the tray. She took the bag. She left. First sale. 1 coin. Ethan watched her go and felt the same thing he felt when the system's first test run displayed a green screen. Not joy yet, confirmation that the system works. Second sale 40 minutes later. A young woman with a child in her arms.
A digestive remedy. The child was crying. The woman looked exhausted. Ethan told her that this remedy could be given to children as young as 3. Half a cup. Not hot, warm. Heron confirmed it. The woman bought 2 packets. Third sale. Fourth. Fifth. By evening, there were 7 coins on the tray, 3 unsold packets, 2 herbal mixtures for warmth, and 1 for headaches. Ethan walked home through the darkening streets and counted 7 coins, 4 measures of rice, or rice and oil, or rice and salt and cheap vegetables. Not wealth, but a vector, a direction. Up, not down. At home, Sehyun met him, not at the gate, in the kitchen. Dinner was on the table, rice with something green. She had found wild sorrel in the garden and sautéed it with the last of the oil. They ate, in silence. Ethan placed 7 coins on the table between the bowls. Sehyun looked at them, small copper circles. She picked one up, turned it over in her fingers, put it back. Said that this was the first money she had earned, because it was her garden, her herbs, her chrysanthemums on the bags. Ethan nodded, said yes. Hers. Sehyun looked up. Both corners of her mouth twitched, both sides, for half a second. Then she lowered her eyes and began clearing the dishes. But Ethan saw it. He saw the full smile, the first one. The next morning he went to the market again. 15 bags. Sehyun had been packing them until dawn, chrysanthemums on every one. He sold 13. On the 3rd day of trading, the old woman returned. She brought a neighbor with her. The old woman said she'd slept like a child, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept without back pain. She bought 3 bags. The neighbor bought 2. Word of mouth, the oldest form of marketing. On the 5th day, a man in a uniform jacket with an emblem approached his stall. The market district inspector. Thin, narrow face, a folder under his arm. He looked at the tray, opened one bag, sniffed the contents, asked if there was a temple seal. Ethan said no seal was required, that it was a tea blend, a food product, not medicine. The inspector said that any product containing medicinal herbs from the catalog of controlled plants must have the temple's approval, that he was obligated to confiscate it. Ethan didn't raise his voice, didn't move. He asked which edition of the catalog listed his herbs. The inspector froze. He hadn't expected the question. Ethan continued. He said that silver mint had been removed from the catalog 17 years ago during a classification review, that white clover had never been included in the catalog as a common plant, that the night aster was classified as ornamental, not medicinal. Heron had pointed out the mint. Ethan had figured out the clover and aster himself through logic. Cheap plants aren't regulated. The economy trumps the law.
The inspector leafed through the folder for a long time. Then he closed it.
He said he'd check it out, that if the information wasn't confirmed, he'd return with a citation. He left. Ethan stood there, feeling his pulse throbbing in his neck. A bluff. A pure bluff. If Mint was still in the catalog, he was finished. That evening he told Sehyun. She listened, then she left. She returned 20 minutes later with a scroll, an old one, very old. The paper was crumbling at the edges. On the scroll was a list of plants bearing the seal of the Temple of the Nine Seals, dated 230 years ago. An old edition of the catalog. Silver mint was listed in it as uncontrolled. 230 years ago, it wasn't in the catalog. Then it was added. Then maybe it was removed. Or maybe not. But they have a document with a seal, an old one, but with a seal. Ethan held the scroll and looked at Sehyun. She stood straight. She looked him in the eyes, without looking away. For the first time in all these days, without looking away. There was neither fear nor uncertainty on her face. There was what he had seen in the best analysts in his past life. A cold, sharp understanding of the task and precise action at the right moment. He said she had just saved their trade. Sehyun lowered her eyes, but after 2 seconds, not right away, a small victory. 3 days after the altercation with the inspector, a horse pulled up to the estate gates. Iris Villard dismounted in a single motion. Her red hair was pulled back into a bun, a men's shirt, pants, a sword at her belt. She tied the horse to a post and entered the courtyard without knocking. Ethan was standing by the outbuilding, spreading herbs out to dry. Iris stopped 5 paces away and said that her father had gotten up, on his own, without help. He'd gone downstairs. He'd eaten a bowl of porridge, a whole one, cleaned it out, for the first time in a year. She said this in an even voice, like a report. But the fingers of her right hand were clenched around the hilt of her sword and wouldn't let go. Ethan nodded. He asked how her nails were. Iris looked at him strangely. She said they were pink, smooth. She'd noticed because Ethan had told her to keep an eye on her nails during his last visit. Heron nodded contentedly from behind. Healing is progressing. Nails are the first indicator. If the indentation is gone, it means the red blood cells are normal. The treatment is working. Iris paused. Then she said she hadn't come just with news, that she'd come with a proposal. That she could see Ethan was working alone, that the estate was large and there weren't enough hands, that she could come and help. Ethan looked at her, a girl with a sword and a pride that wouldn't let her say thank you, but it did let her offer a hand. He said he needed help with the north wall of the garden. It was crumbling. The stones were heavy. He couldn't lift them alone. Iris nodded. She took off her sword. She set it by the door. She rolled up her sleeves. They worked together for 4 hours. The stones of the north wall were made of the same material as the entire house. Dark, dense stone, heavy. Iris hauled them without complaint, silently, with the same focus with which she probably fenced. And Ethan laid them. Yun Shou helped. Not with the stones. Yun Shou was a carpenter, not a mason. But he knew how to set up formwork from planks so the wall wouldn't slide while the mortar dried. There was no mortar. Ethan used clay from the garden mixed with small stones. Not ideal, but it would last for the season. While they worked, Iris spoke.
a little, in short phrases between stones. She explained that the Vellard household had fallen on hard times not because of her father's illness. Earlier, 10 years ago, when their patron refused to protect them. The patron of the Vellard house was Count Carstein. Ethan froze with a stone in his hands. Carstein. That name. From the jade card. Iris continued.
She said that the House of Carstein patronized the small baronies of the Eastern Quarter, took a tax for protection, secured trade rights, represented their interests at court. 10 years ago, Count Carstein turned down the Vellards without explanation. He simply stopped answering their letters. He revoked their trade rights. He withdrew his protection. The Vellards were expelled from the Merchants' Guild for non-payment of the dues that Carstein had previously paid. Baron Vellard tried to re-establish the connections. He traveled to other patrons. He received refusals, because no one wants to get involved with a family that Carstein has rejected. A year later, the debts began. 2 years later, the Baron fell ill. 3 years later, he was bedridden and coughing up blood. Iris carried the weight of the household on her own. She sold everything she could. She learned to fence because there was no money for guards. She learned to trade at the market because the servants had left. She learned not to cry because there was no one to wipe away her tears. She recounted this as facts, without inflection, without self-pity, stone by stone, word by word. Ethan listened and laid the wall and thought. 10 years ago, Carstein rejected the Vellards. 10 years ago, the monks took Mirae. 10 years ago, Sehyun received a 0 on her blood test. 3 events in 1 year. Coincidence or a pattern? He didn't believe in coincidences. Engineers don't believe in coincidences. Engineers believe in cause and effect. What if the Carstein estate turned down the Vellards for a reason? What if the Vellards were connected to the Songhwa clan? Baron Vellard knew Sehyun's grandfather. He came to his funeral. The only one. That's not an acquaintance. That's a connection. And Carstein saw that connection and severed it. He didn't tell Iris that. It's too soon. He needs facts. He asked only one thing. Did she know the Songhwa family before she came to him? Iris looked at him. She thought for a moment. She said her father had mentioned that name a long time ago, when she was little. He said the Songhwas were good people and that if she ever needed help, she could go to them. She didn't understand it then. She decided it was just empty words. Now she wasn't so sure. They finished the wall by sunset. Iris put on her sword. She untied her horse. Before climbing into the saddle, she turned around. She said she would come the day after tomorrow, that there were still more walls. Ethan nodded. Iris rode off. Ethan stood by the restored wall and thought that the threads of this story stretched farther than he had imagined, that the Carstein house didn't just want to test Sehyun. It was systematically destroying everyone connected to the Songhwa clan, slowly, quietly, without swords, economically, by taking away patronage, by cutting off trade routes, by isolating, by driving them into poverty and disease. 10 years, methodically, professionally. Like an engineer disconnecting one node from the system after another. Ethan knew this method. He'd used it himself when dismantling old systems. You shut down the periphery, then the connections, then the core. But the core is still working. The core is Sehyun,
and Mire somewhere in the mountains, and the sealed legacy of the Songhwa clan. Karstein hadn't reached the core, not yet anyway. That evening, Ethan told Sehyun that the Villards had been under Karstein's protection and that the protection had been revoked 10 years ago. Sehyun listened. Her face was impassive. Then she said quietly that 10 years ago, everything fell apart. Her grandfather died. Mire disappeared. Her mother left to stay with relatives and never returned. Her father turned to drink and died 3 years later as well. She was left with her aunt and her father's younger brother. Her aunt moved to the countryside. Her brother joined the army. She was left alone with Lady Wan in an empty house.
7 years alone. Until the day she was told a groom had been found, the third son of the impoverished Baron Reyes, her last chance. She agreed without a second thought, because being alone was worse. Ethan listened, and the map of this world became both more complex and clearer at the same time. 10 years ago, someone set in motion the process of destroying everything connected to the Songhwa family. Not a war, not a massacre, a quiet dismantling. And the only one who does such things quietly is the one who fears the noise, the one who fears that the truth will come to light. Baron Villard was back on his feet on the 12th day of treatment. Iris rode up in the morning. She dismounted at the gate. She didn't tie up her horse. She entered the courtyard at a brisk pace. Her face was different, not stony, alive. She spoke a single sentence. Her father came down the stairs on his own. Ethan nodded. He went with her. 3 blocks. The Villard house. The Baron was sitting in an armchair on the ground floor. The chair stood by the window. The shutters were open. Light fell on the face of a large man with sunken cheeks and sallow skin. But he was sitting, without cushions, without support. His back was straight, his hands on the armrests, his nails pink and even, his eyes clear. He looked at Ethan and said he knew what he had done, that the medicines sold by the 5 charlatans before him were chalk and water, that he had checked, that he had opened all 5 vials and poured them into a pot, and not even a flower grew. Ethan sat down across from him. He said the treatment wasn't finished, that it would take at least 2 more weeks, that the body was weak, that it mustn't be overburdened. The Baron nodded. Then he asked how Ethan knew these recipes. Ethan told the truth. Part of the truth. He said they were from his wife's dowry, that the Songhwa family had great herbalists, and their knowledge was preserved in scrolls. The Baron was silent for a minute. Then he said he had known Grandfather Sehyun, Songhwa Chansu, a quiet man, never raised his voice. He grew herbs. He treated his neighbors for free. Once he healed Villard's broken leg in 3 days. The bone had healed perfectly. Not a single temple healer could explain how. Chansu said it was just an ointment, a good ointment. That was all. The Baron smiled at the memory, the first smile Ethan had ever seen on that face. Then the smile faded. The Baron said that Chansu had died strangely, quickly, overnight. A healthy 50-year-old man went to bed and didn't wake up. The doctors said it was his heart. The Baron didn't believe it. A healthy man who heals others doesn't die of a heart attack overnight. But there was no proof. A week after Chansu's death, an envoy from Count Karstein came to the Lard and announced that the patronage had been revoked. No reasons, no explanations, just revoked. The Baron connected these 2 events. But what could a minor baron do without a patron, without connections, without money. Nothing. He remained silent for 10 years, and he suffered. Ethan listened. Every word fell into place. Grandfather Sehyun was murdered. He didn't die. He was murdered. Karstein had him eliminated because Chan-su knew the recipes. Because through the recipes, one could get to the inheritance. Karstein was covering his tracks. The method was the same. Quiet, professional. No swords, no blood. Poison in the night, and the withdrawal of patronage in the morning. He didn't tell the Baron what he was thinking. Not now. The Baron is still weak. He can't handle heavy thoughts. He needs to recover. Iris walked Ethan to the gate. At the gate, she stopped. She looked at him. She said that her father had told her more than he had told Ethan, that before his death, Chan-su had given Villard a letter, sealed, with a request to give it to whoever marries Sehyun. Iris looked straight at Ethan. Green eyes, without evasion. She said the letter was in her father's chest, that she would bring it tomorrow. Ethan nodded. He walked home and thought. Sehyun's grandfather knew. He knew he was going to die, or he was afraid he would die, and he prepared himself. He left scrolls in the dowry. He left tools. He left the calligraphy set. He left the garden with seeds waiting for water. He left the letter with the person he trusted. Grandfather Sehyun was an engineer, not in the same sense as Ethan, in a different one. He built a system that was meant to outlive his death, a distributed system, with no single point of failure. The scrolls in one place, the tools in another, the letter in a third, the garden in a fourth, mire in a fifth. Each element is useless on its own. Together, they form a legacy. But only the one who marries Sehyun can bring them together, because only through her do the ancestors' modules open. Only through her do the scrolls become recipes, and the tools become techniques. Grandfather Chan-su designed a trap. No, not a trap, a castle. A castle whose key is Sehyun. Ethan reached the estate. He entered the gate. Sehyun was standing in the garden by the fountain. Purple asters bloomed around her, a whole meadow. She had watered them every evening, for 3 weeks, and they had responded by blooming. She turned around. She saw him. She raised her hand. She didn't wave. She just raised it. She showed that she saw him, that he had returned. A small gesture, a huge meaning. For the first time, she showed that it mattered to her to see him return. The letter was old. The paper had yellowed. The dark red wax seal had cracked, but held. Iris had brought it that morning. She'd placed it on the kitchen table. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Sehyun. She said she would wait in the courtyard. She went out. Ethan and Sehyun sat across from each other. The letter lay between them. Sehyun looked at the seal, a chrysanthemum in a circle, the seal of the Songhwa clan. She recognized her grandfather's handwriting. Ethan saw her fingers tremble. Once, briefly, then they calmed down. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper. The handwriting was small and even, neat. Grandfather Chan-su wrote like a man who knew that every word was his last. Ethan read aloud, slowly. To whoever is reading this letter, if you are reading this, it means you have married my granddaughter. If you have married her,
It means you are either a fool or the one we have been waiting for. I hope it is the latter. Sehyun is not a barren branch. She is the root. Everything that has been in our clan lives within her. But it is sealed. We placed the seal ourselves, not our enemies, us. 16 generations ago, when we realized that those who shouldn't have our blood were hunting for it. The seal cannot be broken by force. It cannot be broken by ritual. It cannot be broken by judgment.
The seal can be broken in only one way: love. Not a word, not an oath, an action. When someone does something for Sehyun, not for their own sake, but for hers, every day, without reward, without expectation, then the seal will begin to melt, slowly, layer by layer, and the legacy will be revealed. Not to you, to her. Ethan paused. He looked at Sehyun. She sat motionless, eyes wide open, hands on her knees. He continued. Mirae is alive. I sent her to the Temple of the Scarlet Seal because she has too much power, and if Karstein finds out, he'll kill her, just like he killed my brother, just like he killed my wife, just as he'll kill me. I know I'll die soon. They're already close, but I made it in time. The scrolls are in the dowry. The tools are in the chest. The garden is planted with seeds that are waiting. Each element on its own is rubbish. Together, they're the key. Gather them, not for power, for her, so she can discover who she truly is, so she can stop being afraid. The letter ended with a single line. Take care of her. She's the only thing I've ever done right. The silence in the kitchen was so thick that Ethan could hear Sehyun breathing, slowly, deeply, like a person holding from falling. She wasn't crying. She sat there, holding on, like a wall he had repaired, stone by stone, clay and stubbornness. Then she stood up, went out into the garden. Ethan didn't follow her. Through the kitchen window he saw her walk to the fountain, to the asters. She stood among the purple flowers, dropped to her knees, and cried, silently. Her shoulders shook. Her hands clenched the earth. She was crying in the garden her grandfather had planted for her 20 years ago, among the flowers that had waited 800 years. Ethan stood by the window and didn't move. Head-In was crying too. He could feel it. Warm drops somewhere at the back of his neck. Youngso was silent. It was hard, like a man who doesn't know how to cry, but wants to. 10 minutes later, Sehyun returned. Her face was wet. Her eyes were red, but her back was straight. She sat down in her seat. She looked at Ethan. She said she wanted to go to her sister's. Ethan nodded. He said they would go, but not now. First, they needed to prepare. They needed money for the trip. They needed protection for the estate while they were away. They needed a plan. Sehyun nodded. She understood. She was the daughter of a grandfather who planned 20 years ahead. Patience was in her blood. That same day, Ethan made 3 decisions. First, double tea production. More bags, more varieties, more customers. They needed money fast. Second,
Ask Iris to guard the estate when the time came to leave. Iris with a sword at the gate is more secure than any castle. Third, find a way to contact Aunt Sehyun. Mrs. Won said that Aunt Sehyun had left for a village east of the capital. Maybe she knows something else.
Maybe she has her own piece of the mosaic that Grandfather Chansu put together. That evening, he sat in the outbuilding bagging herbs. His hands moved automatically. His mind was calculating. 30 bags a day is 30 coins a week at the current exchange rate. The trip to the Tibet Mountains would cost at least 50 coins. Food for 6 days there and back. A horse. Warm clothes. It's cold in the mountains, even in summer. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, he'd save up enough. If trade didn't grind to a halt, if the inspector didn't return, if Karstein didn't make his next move. A lot of ifs. Ethan was used to a lot of ifs. All his past work consisted of a lot of ifs. If the server doesn't crash, if the client doesn't change his mind, if the code doesn't break. The difference is that the stakes are higher here. Not a contract or a bonus, a living girl in a mountain temple, a living woman in a garden among asters. He finished packing. 50 bags for tomorrow. Chrysanthemums on each one. Sehyun drew them while sitting on the floor in the room by the light of an oil lamp. 50 chrysanthemums. 50 different ones, each one alive. He looked at the bags and thought that in a past life, his products had been lines of code and integration protocols, and here his product was dried herbs in paper with a flower drawn by a hand that 3 weeks ago couldn't hold a needle. He went to bed. In the dark, he heard Sehyun quietly humming something in the next room. For the first time in all these days. The melody was simple, without words, quiet as the rustling of leaves. Mrs. Won said that Sehyun had stopped singing after the blood test. 10 years of silence. And now, in the darkness, a quiet voice. Ethan closed his eyes. Herin listened. Yun-so listened. The 2 dead ancestors in his mind listened as their descendants sang for the first time in 10 years. And they were silent, because some things require no comment. On the 25th day, 2 things happened at once. The first, the inspector returned, in the morning, to Ethan's spot at the market. A second man came with him, short, round, in an expensive gray robe. On his chest, a medallion bearing the image of 9 seals, a temple priest. The inspector said he had conducted an investigation, that Silver Mint had been reclassified as a controlled plant 8 years ago, that the old documents were no longer legally valid if there was a later version, that the trade was illegal. The priest stood nearby and said nothing. He looked at the bags, at the chrysanthemums, at Ethan. His eyes were small and watchful. Ethan stood there weighing his options. Arguing was pointless. The law was on their side. Running was foolish. There was nowhere to hide. He took the tray, removed all the bags, carefully, one by one. He put them in a canvas bag. He said he understood and would comply. The inspector nodded. The priest kept watching. Then he asked how Ethan knew the recipe for these mixtures. His voice was soft. Polite. Dangerous. Ethan said from his wife's family records. The priest asked which family. Ethan said, Songhwa. The priest blinked. Once, quickly. Then his face smoothed out again. He said it was interesting, that the Songhwa lineage was considered extinct, that it was curious the family records had survived. Then he nodded to the inspector and left. No threats, no orders. He just left. Ethan stood there with his bag of groceries and realized that something worse than confiscation had just happened. He had been noticed. Not by the inspector, by the temple. The name Songhwa had been spoken aloud in front of the man who wore the medallion with 9 seals. The information would go up the chain, to those who knew what that name meant. He walked home quickly. His mind was racing. Business at the market was over. His main source of income was lost. He had enough coins to last 2 weeks. Then the money would run out. He needed a new sales channel, or a new product, or a new approach.
A second surprise awaited him at home. An unfamiliar woman stood at the gate, tall, stern, in a perfectly pressed dark green robe. On her nose, glasses in thin metal frames. The glasses glowed, barely noticeably, a greenish light, an artifact. Standing next to her was a young servant boy with a suitcase. The woman saw Ethan and bowed. Briefly, formally, she introduced herself. Evelyn Dvorak, blood appraiser of the Temple of the 9 Seals, sent for a standard inspection of the heiress of the Songhwa family at the request of House Carstein. Ethan froze. Here it was. Carstein's next move. Not through the smiling steward, through official channels, through the temple. Evelyn looked at him through her glowing glasses. Her face was inscrutable, professional. She said the check was mandatory, that refusal was a violation of the decree on genealogical transparency, that the consequences of refusal were a fine and possible arrest. Ethan looked at her. He thought. 3 seconds. 5. 7. Then he said she could come in, that he had no objection to the check, that he asked for only one thing: to conduct the inspection tomorrow morning, not now, because his wife was currently working in the garden and he didn't want to interrupt her. Evelyn looked at him strangely. She had expected a refusal, a scandal, threats, not a polite request to wait. She nodded, said she would stay at a hotel 2 blocks away, that she would come at dawn tomorrow. She took the young servant and left. Ethan stood at the gate and breathed, deeply, slowly. He had just let the wolf into the sheepfold, willingly. Why? Because refusal is worse. Refusal is an admission that you're hiding something, that you have something to hide. Consent is confidence, or the appearance of confidence. He went into the house. He found Sehyun in the garden. She was standing among the asters with a watering can in her hands. She turned around. She saw his face. She set the watering can down on the ground. Ethan told her. About the inspector. About the priest. About the closure of the market. About Evelyn Dvorak. About tomorrow's assessment.
Sehyun listened. Her face paled with every word. When he finished, she was silent for a full minute. Then she said the assessment would show 0, just like when she was 7, because the seal is still in place, because nothing has changed. Ethan looked at her. He said that something had changed, that he had activated 2 ancestral modules through her blood, that the system is working, that the seal
is melting, and he doesn't know what the assessor will see. Maybe a 0, maybe more, maybe something neither of them expects. Sehyun stood among the purple flowers and looked at him. There was fear in her eyes, real fear, deep. The fear of a 7-year-old girl who was told she was empty, who believed it, who had lived with it for 12 years, and who now feared it would be confirmed again. Ethan walked over to her, stood beside her, didn't touch her.
Didn't hug her, just stood there, and said that whatever the assessment showed tomorrow, it didn't define who she is, that her hands no longer tremble, that she brews tea that makes old women at the market cry, that she drew 500 chrysanthemums and each one was alive, that she sings at night and the 2 ancestors inside his head fall silent to listen, that the evaluator measures numbers, but he sees a person. Sehyun stood there. She watched. She didn't look away. For a long time. Then she said quietly that he was a strange man, that normal husbands don't say things like that. Ethan said he wasn't a normal husband, that he was an engineer who had died in another world and woke up here. He said that and froze. He hadn't planned it. It just slipped out. Sehyun looked at him. 5 seconds. 10. Then she said she knew. That from the very first day, she'd known he wasn't the man he used to be. That the old Ethan couldn't lift a glass without a servant's help. That the old Ethan didn't know what a callus was. That she didn't know who he was. But she knew that he'd come and fixed the gate and healed her hands and found herbs and made it so she could sing again. And that was enough. She turned and went into the house. Ethan stood among the asters and realized that something had just happened that wasn't part of his plan. She knew. All this time she knew he was different. And she kept quiet, and brought tea, and painted chrysanthemums, and waited. He looked up at the sky. Tomorrow morning the blood appraiser would come. A woman with glowing glasses and a temple medallion. She would look at Sehyun and name a number, and that number could change everything, or change nothing. He went into the house. He needed to prepare for tomorrow, but something had changed inside him. Herin had been warm, Yun-so had been warm, and somewhere deep within the system, a line flashed that he read only out of the corner of his eye. Synergy level elevated. Condition for unlocking the 3rd module fulfilled. Awaiting activation. Evelyn Dvorak arrived at dawn, just as she promised. Her robe was ironed, her glasses were in place. The greenish glow of the lenses in the morning twilight made her face look like a mask. A boy servant carried a wooden case of instruments behind her. Ethan met her at the gate. He led her into the room he had prepared the night before. He carried the bench out of the entryway. He set up a table. He laid a clean cloth on the table, the only white cloth he could find in the house. A former bed sheet, but clean and ironed. Mrs. Wan had ironed it with a hot stone for 2 hours. Evelyn entered. She looked around. A poor room, bare walls, not a single decoration, but clean. She nodded. She placed the case on the table. She opened it. Inside, on a velvet lining, lay 3 objects: a stone bowl the size of a palm, a silver needle as long as a finger,
and a small vial of clear liquid.
Evelyn took out each object and placed it on the cloth. Her movements were precise, well rehearsed, a ritual she had performed hundreds of times. She asked where the heiress was. Ethan called for Sehyun. Sehyun entered, pale, hands at her sides. Her fingers weren't trembling, but they were clenched into fists. She looked at the instruments on the table and closed her eyes for a second. Ethan saw her gathering herself, piece by piece, like a wall of stones. She opened her eyes and sat down on the bench. Evelyn looked at her through her glasses. The glow of the lenses intensified. She frowned, barely noticeable. For a split second, then her face smoothed out again. She asked Sehyun to place her hand on the table, palm up. Sehyun did so. Evelyn took a silver needle. She pricked Sehyun's finger with a quick, precise movement. A drop of blood fell into the stone bowl, dark red against the gray stone. Evelyn added 3 drops of a clear liquid from a vial.
The blood in the bowl began to change color, slowly, from red to brown, from brown to gray, a standard reaction for a withered branch. Ethan knew this. Hedin had hinted at it. Gray means empty blood, an absence of active memory. 0. Evelyn stared into the bowl. Her face was inscrutable. She waited. 1 second. 2. 5. The blood turned gray. Completely gray. Like ashes. Sehyun sat with her eyes closed. She knew what the appraiser would see. The same as 12 years ago. Empty. 0. A withered branch. Evelyn opened her mouth to deliver the verdict, and at that moment, the gray liquid in the bowl stirred. Not all of it. A single dot in the center, tiny, like a pinprick. Purple, the color of a night-blooming aster. Evelyn froze. She took off her glasses, put them back on, leaned toward the bowl. The purple dot didn't disappear. It pulsed, slowly, like a heartbeat. Evelyn straightened up. She looked at Sehyun, then at Ethan, then back into the bowl. She was silent for 30 seconds. Ethan counted. Then she said the result was inconclusive, that the bulk of the blood showed a standard negative result, but that there was an anomaly, a small one, inexplicable, an active point in a sealed mass. She uttered the word sealed and stopped short. She looked at Ethan with a quick, sharp glance. She shouldn't have said that. The word slipped out. A professional mistake, or professional honesty. Ethan didn't move. His expression didn't change, but inside, everything tightened. She saw the seal. She knows that the blood isn't empty, but sealed. That means she knows the difference. It means this isn't the first time she's seen sealed blood, or that she's been trained to recognize seals, which in turn means that the Temple of the 9 Seals knows about the existence of the seals and remains silent. Evelyn put the instruments back in the case, quickly. Her hands were slightly less steady than when she'd taken them out. She was nervous. Ethan could tell by the micro movements of her fingers. She closed the case and turned to face them. She said the official assessment result was 0, standard for a withered branch, that she would file a report with the temple, that the anomaly would be noted in her personal journal,
but not in an official document. She said this and looked at Ethan, directly, for a long time, like someone making a choice and wanting that choice to be noticed. Ethan noticed. She could have written about the anomaly in the report, could have called in senior evaluators, could have informed Carstein. She didn't do that. She chose silence. Why? He didn't know. Not yet. Evelyn bowed, briefly. She walked to the door, stopped at the door, didn't turn around, said the chrysanthemums on the bags were beautiful, that she'd bought one bag at the market 3 days ago, a remedy for a headache, that it works. Then she left. Ethan stood and looked at the closed door. Sehyun sat nearby, eyes open, wet.
She saw a purple dot in the bowl. She saw how the ashes in her blood came to life. A single dot, small, but alive. She turned to Ethan, said she wasn't empty. Her voice was quiet, shaky, not from weakness, from something else. Ethan said no, not empty, never had been. Sehyun stood up, walked over to him, close, closer than ever. She raised her hand and touched his wrist with her fingertips, gently, like a chrysanthemum petal falling on water. And at that moment, something flashed in Ethan's mind. Not a system window, not text, an image. A woman with a paintbrush in her hand, delicate features, black hair with a silver strand at her temple, eyes like Sehyun's, exactly like Sehyun's. Module open. Songhwa Na-yeon, calligrapher and artist, 420 years ago. Knowledge flooded in. Not grass, not a tree. Lines, shapes, proportions, 1,000 ways to move a brush across paper. Calligraphy like architecture. Every stroke carries meaning. Every turn of the brush is a decision. Ethan looked at Sehyun and understood why the third module was this one. Sehyun was drawing chrysanthemums. 500 chrysanthemums, each one alive. Not because she was an artist, because an artist from 400 years ago lived in her blood. Na-yeon waited, just as Hae-rin had waited, just as Yoon-so had waited, just as the aster waited for water. Sehyun withdrew her hand. She stepped back. She lowered her eyes. Ethan exhaled. 3 modules: the herbalist, the carpenter, the calligrapher. 3 facets of a single legacy. 3 tools. And now he knew what to do with the closed market. Calligraphy. In this world where aristocrats are obsessed with pedigrees, calligraphy isn't just an art. It's currency. Family scrolls, official documents, invitations, marriage contracts. Everything is handwritten. Everything requires a master, and there are few masters. And they're all expensive. Ethan smiled. A second product, not tea. Calligraphy. Not a medicine, so it doesn't fall under the temple's control. He went to look for brushes. Calligraphy turned out to be harder than herbs and wood. Hae-rin imparted knowledge gently. Yoon-so was strict but clear. Na-yeon gave nothing. She demonstrated. Once. Quickly. And waited. If Ethan couldn't repeat it, she demonstrated again. Just as quickly. Without leniency. Without explanation. Just the movement of the brush in the air, somewhere between his eyes and the back of his head. Ethan sat in the outbuilding in front of a sheet of paper and tried to draw a line. A straight, vertical line. A brush from Grandpa Chen Su's calligraphy set. Ink from the same inkstone. The line came out crooked, shaky, lifeless. Nayun was silent. The silence was icy. Not hostile, demanding. She was a master who tolerated no sloppiness, not even from a student. Especially not from a student. Ethan drew 100 lines, then another 100, then more. He ran out of paper. He went into the garden.
Found a smooth stone, dipped the brush in water, and began writing on the stone. The lines dried and vanished within a minute. An endless canvas. He painted for 3 hours. His hands ached. His back ached. His eyes watered from the strain. As the 3rd hour drew to a close, Nayun responded for the first time. Not with a word, not with an image, with a sensation in the brush of his right hand, as if someone had gently taken his wrist and guided him. The line turned out smooth, alive, with a slight thickening at the start and an ending as thin as a hair. A beautiful line. The first one. He watched it as it dried and faded away. Then he made another one. And another. By evening, he could write the 3 basic elements, vertical, horizontal, a dot. That's not enough for calligraphy, but enough to start with. Nayun approved. The ice at the back of his neck grew slightly warmer, by a degree. Meanwhile, Sehyun solved the trading problem on her own, without Ethan, without his plan, without his permission. He returned from the rock to the house and found 20 paper bags of chrysanthemums on the kitchen table. Mrs. Wan was standing nearby, counting copper coins. 12 coins. Ethan asked what was going on. Mrs. Wan said that Mrs. Sehyun had sent her to the market, not to their usual spot, to the residential neighborhoods, to the laundries and sewing shops, to places where women work. Mrs. Wan went from door to door offering tea blends, not as merchandise, as a gift from a neighbor. The first bag for free, the second for a coin. 12 women bought a bag each. 3 asked her to come back tomorrow with a new batch. Ethan stood there looking at the coins, then at Sehyun. She was sitting by the window, drawing a chrysanthemum on a paper bag. She didn't look up, but the corners of her lips were turned up. Both. She had circumvented the restriction, in her own way, not by reclassifying the product, by reclassifying the sales channel.
The market is controlled by inspectors. Private door-to-door sales are controlled by no one, because none of the aristocrats had ever sold door-to-door. It was beneath their dignity. Sehyun had no dignity to lose. In the eyes of this world, she was a nobody, and that was precisely why she could do what no aristocrat could. Go to the common people, talk to them, be among them. Ethan sat down beside her. He said she was a genius. Sehyun snorted, quietly, almost inaudibly. It was the first time he'd heard that sound from her, a snort. Like a chuckle that hadn't quite dared to become a laugh. For the next 3 days, they worked in parallel. Ethan was learning calligraphy. Sehyun and Mrs. Wan were selling tea door to door. Iris came by every other day to help with the estate. She replaced the second gate panel, which had started to come loose. She tightened the hinges. She repaired the well cover. She worked silently and fiercely, like someone who doesn't know how to express gratitude with words and does so with their hands. Baron Villard got up every day. He walked around the house. He ate alone. He hadn't coughed for 3 days in a row.
Iris didn't mention it, but her movements had become lighter, as if a stone she'd been carrying for 3 years had been lifted from her shoulders. On the 4th day, Ethan was ready for his first job. Not a masterpiece, a working sample. He needed a client for calligraphy, someone who needed a scroll or a document or an invitation. The client found him. In the evening, a man came to the gate, not young, well-dressed, not an aristocrat, a merchant. He asked if Baron Reyes, the one who sold tea at the market, lived here. Ethan said yes. The merchant said his wife had bought a sleep remedy, that she now sleeps like a baby, that he was grateful, and that he had a request. His daughter is getting married in a month. He needs a scroll with good wishes for the newlyweds.
Calligraphic. Beautiful. Masters in the capital charge 50 silver coins for such a scroll. He has 20. Could the Baron help?
Ethan looked at the merchant. 50 silver coins. Not copper, silver. 1 silver coin is equal to 100 copper ones. His weekly income from tea is 100 copper coins. 1 silver coin. 20 silver coins is 20 weeks of the tea trade. He said he could, that he would do it for 15 silver coins. The merchant beamed. He shook his hand, left. Ethan closed the gate and leaned his back against it. 15 silver for a single scroll. The Nayon in his head was satisfied, coldly satisfied, like a master who knows the value of his work. All that remained was to write this scroll so that it was worth 15 silver. Ethan wrote the scroll for 7 days, every morning from dawn, every evening until dark. Nayon gave him no quarter. She rejected the first draft entirely. The lines were smooth but lifeless. The second draft, too. Beautiful but empty.
No soul. No story.
On the 3rd day, Ethan stopped. He sat down on the floor. He looked at the ruined sheets of paper around him, and he thought, Nayon doesn't want beauty. She wants meaning. Calligraphy isn't just drawing letters. It's a conversation. Every stroke speaks. About whom? About those for whom the scroll is written. About the merchant's daughter who is getting married. About her future husband. About the life that lies ahead. Ethan didn't know these people. He went to the merchant and asked. The merchant was surprised. No calligrapher had ever asked before. They just wrote standard phrases in standard styles. The merchant told him. His daughter loves to draw. Her fiancé makes pottery. They met at the market when she came to buy paints and he was selling pots. She drew his pot. He fired her drawing onto a plate. A year later, they decided to get married. The merchant told this with a gentle smile. Not a grand story, not a feat.
A small, warm story of 2 people who found each other through their craft. Ethan returned home, sat down at the table, picked up a brush. And Nayon finally spoke. She didn't show it. She spoke. Not with words, with movement. His hand moved on its own, not automatically, consciously, but with a direction that went deeper than muscle memory. The strokes became different. The well wishes for the young couple were written in a style that united 2 movements, one stroke soft and rounded like an artist's brush, the next sharp and precise like a potter's hand. The 2 styles intertwined and created a third, a new one that didn't exist in any calligraphy textbook. Integration.
2 systems becoming one. Ethan wrote for 3 hours without a break. When he finished, he stood up and looked. The scroll was beautiful, but not with a decorative beauty, alive. Like Sehyun's chrysanthemums on the bags, every stroke spoke, told a story of paint and clay. Nayeon was pleased.
For the first time, completely. Warmth spread across the back of his neck like hot tea down his throat. He took the scroll to the merchant. The merchant unrolled it on the counter. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put 20 silver coins on the table. Not 15, 20. He said it was worth more, that his daughter would cry when she saw it. Ethan took 15. He returned 5. He said they'd agreed on 15. The merchant looked at him strangely. Then he nodded and took the 5 coins back. Ethan walked home with 15 silver coins in his pocket and felt their weight. Heavy little circles. The road to the Taebaek Mountains costs 50 copper coins. He has 15 silver coins. That's 1,500 copper coins. 30 times more than he needs. At home, he laid the silver on the table in front of Sehyun. She looked at the coins, then at him. He said it was time to go get Mirae. Sehyun was silent for 5 seconds. Then she stood up. She went to her room. She returned a minute later. In her hands was a small bundle of belongings. She was ready. She had been ready ever since the day he said they were leaving. She had been waiting. The bundle had been packed and was lying in the corner of her room. Ready. Ethan looked at the bundle and at her face and thought that he would never again in his life underestimate quiet people. The next morning, Ethan spoke with Iris. He told her he was leaving for 6 days, that Sehyun was going with him, that the estate would be empty, that he needed someone at the gate. Iris didn't ask a single question. She said she would live at the estate until he returned, that her father was strong enough to stay alone with her mother, that she had a sword and she had her hands, that this would be enough. She led her horse over and tied it to the gate. Ethan realized that the horse was her answer to the question he hadn't asked, how they would get to the mountains. 1 horse, 2 riders, a 3-day journey. They set out at dawn. Sehyun sat in front of him in the saddle. Small, light, back straight, hands on the bow. She didn't look back at the estate. Not once. She looked ahead, at the road, toward the north, toward the mountains, toward her sister. The capital was left behind by noon. The road led through fields, then through a forest, then upward, into the hills. The air changed. It grew colder, thinner. Ethan felt his body reacting to the altitude, a slight dizziness, rapid breathing. The body of the Baron's former 3rd son was not accustomed to the mountain air. Sehyun breathed evenly. She had grown up in the capital, but her blood was mountain blood. The Songhwa clan originated from the northern hill. Ethan knew this from Hedin. 1,000 years ago, the Songhwa lived in the mountains. They gathered herbs on the slopes. They built houses from mountain stone. They descended into the valley only to trade. Then Karstein came, and the Songhwa came down for good. Not of their own free will. They rode all day. By evening, they stopped by a stream. Ethan built a fire. Yunso's skills. Not a bonfire, but a hearth, stacked from stones according to 600-year-old rules, an even flame, little smoke, maximum heat.
Sehyun took 2 tea bags out of her pack, her own blend, for warmth. She brewed them in the camping pot Iris had given her for the journey. They drank tea by the fire, in silence. Stars overhead, different stars, a foreign sky, but the tea was familiar, and the silence was familiar, and the person beside her was her own. Ethan looked at Sehyun. She was looking at the fire. Her face was calm, beautiful in the light of the flames. She said she was afraid, that she was afraid to see Mirae, because she didn't know what to say, because for 10 years she'd thought her sister was dead, and she'd lived with that, got used to it, built a wall. And now the wall was crumbling, and behind it was not silence, but a living person.
Ethan said it was normal, that it was normal to be afraid, that she didn't have to know what to say, that sometimes it was enough just to be there. Sehyun looked at him, the fire reflected in her eyes. She nodded. She lay down by the fire. She closed her eyes. 3 minutes later, she was breathing evenly. She was asleep. Ethan sat and looked at her and at the sky and thought that in his past life he hadn't found a single person worth riding 3 days on horseback into the cold mountains for, and that maybe that was the real reason why he'd crashed into that bridge. Not fatigue. Emptiness. The Temple of the Red Seal stood on the mountainside like a bird of prey's nest. Stone walls, red tiles, a narrow path winding upward between the rocks. No fence, no gate, just the path and silence. They arrived around noon on the 3rd day. They left the horse at the foot of the mountain, tied to a pine tree. From there they continued on foot. The path was steep. The rocks were slippery from the morning fog. Sehyun walked ahead. Without looking back, her back straight, her step confident, as if her body knew this path, even though she had never been here before. Her blood knew. A monk stood at the temple entrance, an old man, a very old man, a gray robe, a shaved head. His face was like tree bark. He looked at Sehyun, and his eyes widened. For a split second, then his face went blank. He asked why they had come. Sehyun said they were looking for her sister. The monk was silent. 10 seconds. 20. Then he said that the girl they were looking for was no longer a girl, that 10 years had passed, that she had changed. He turned and went inside. They followed him. The temple corridors were dark and cold, stone, torches in the walls, the smell of incense and something metallic, the smell of blood. Harin tensed. Yunsong tensed. Nayeong said nothing but also stepped back, retreating deeper into the shadows. The 3 ancestors inside Ethan's mind sensed something within the walls of this temple, something ancient and powerful. The monk led them into an open courtyard inside the temple, square, stone floor. In the center, a wooden pole with notches, a training pole. A girl stood by the pole, short, thin, long black hair the same shade as Sehyun's, but her eyes were different, not quiet, not downcast, bright, burning, angry. She stood in a training stance, bare feet on the stone, hands clenched into fists, old calluses on her knuckles. She was dressed in a gray monk's robe, but the robe had sweat stains and tears in the sleeves. She had been training, alone, for 10 years.
Cho Meyer, 17 years old, alive. Sehyun stopped at the entrance to the courtyard. She didn't move. She watched. Meyer turned around. She saw them. She looked for 5 seconds. Her face didn't change. No joy, no surprise. Then she said one word. Sister. Not a name. Just sister. Like a fact. A statement.
Sehyun took a step forward. Her legs buckled. Ethan caught her by the elbow, held her. She straightened up, gently pushed his hand away, walked on her own, across the courtyard, toward the pillar, toward her sister. Stopped 2 steps away. Mirae looked up at her. Sehyun was taller, older, paler. Mirae was shorter, younger, darker from the mountain sun. They stood and looked at each other, and between them lay 10 years of silence and lies about death and an empty house and winter and loneliness. Sehyun raised her hand. Slowly, she touched Mirae's cheek. Mirae didn't pull away. She stood there, like the pillar behind her. Her eyes were burning, her jaw was clenched. She wasn't crying. She had stopped crying 10 years ago, or rather, she hadn't stopped. She had forbidden herself to cry. Sehyun didn't say anything. She just stood there, touching her cheek. Then she withdrew her hand. She stepped back, turned to Ethan. Her eyes were wet, but her face was calm. She nodded.
That nod meant everything. She's here. She's alive. We've come. Ethan approached. He looked at Meyer. Meyer looked at him. Harshly, appraisingly, like a beast deciding friend or foe. She asked who he was. Her voice was low for a girl, hoarse from silence or from screaming. Ethan said he was her sister's husband. Meyer looked at Sehyun, back at Ethan. She said she didn't know her sister had gotten married, that she hadn't been told anything at all for 10 years. Her voice grew louder, sharper. Anger rose from the depths like lava. The monk behind them coughed, quietly, but Meyer heard it. She fell silent, clenched her fists. Ethan looked at her and saw everything. 10 years of isolation. 10 years among silent monks on a mountaintop. 10 years without a family, without a home, without a name. They told her it was for her own protection. Maybe that was true. But a child who was torn away from her sister at the age of 7 doesn't need protection. She needs a home. He said they had come to take her away. Mirae looked at the monk. The monk looked at Ethan. For a long time. Then he said that the girl wasn't his prisoner, that the temple doors had always been open, that she could have left any day. Mirae snorted, loudly, angrily. She said the doors were open, the road down was open too. But where could a 7-year-old girl go when she'd been told her whole family was dead? The silence in the stone courtyard was heavy. Ethan turned to the monk. He asked calmly who had told her that her family was dead. The monk didn't answer. He looked away. For the first time during the entire conversation. Ethan nodded. He understood. The monks hadn't saved Mirae. They'd been hiding her. On whose orders? Grandfather Chansu's? Or Karstain's? Or both? Chansu wanted to hide his granddaughter from Karstein,
But who could guarantee that the monks would listen to a dead grandfather rather than a living count? Who had paid the temple for 10 years to support the girl?
These questions could be asked later. Right now, something else was more important. He held out his hand to Mirae. She looked at his hand, at him, at her sister. She didn't take his hand. She walked past him. She stood next to Sehyun, shoulder to shoulder. 2 sisters, black hair, different eyes, same blood. They left the temple together. Mirae walked without looking back, just like Sehyun when they left the estate, not looking back at what caused pain. A family trait. The descent was harder than the ascent. Mirae stopped by the horse. She looked at the animal, said she had never ridden a horse. Ethan lifted her into the saddle. She clung to the mane and clenched her teeth. Sehyun sat behind her. She wrapped her arms around her waist. Mirae tensed up. Then she slowly relaxed, millimeter by millimeter. Ethan led the horse by the reins, on foot, downward, through the forest, over the hills, home. At the first rest stop, Mirae ate 3 servings of rice. At the second, she fell asleep instantly, leaning against a rock. Sehyun sat beside her and stroked her hair, quietly, like a mother, like a sister, like a person who had waited 10 years for this very moment and now was afraid to blink lest it disappear. They returned to the estate on the 6th day. The gates were intact. Iris was standing in the courtyard with a sword at her belt and a bucket in her hand. She was watering the asters. She saw them and set down the bucket. She looked at Mirae. Mirae looked at her. 2 pairs of hard eyes met and parted, without words. Then Mirae looked at the estate, at the walls, at the roof, at the garden, at the purple flowers by the fountain. She stood and looked, and her face changed. Slowly. The anger that was like armor began to slip away. Beneath it was a child. A 7-year-old girl who remembered this courtyard, this well, this wall. She remembered. She had left here 10 years ago, at night in the darkness, with 2 unfamiliar monks, and thought she would never return. Mirae walked over to the fountain, to the broken stone basin. She sat down. She touched the stone. Then she touched a purple aster flower. Her fingers were rough, calloused from the training pole. A delicate flower beneath rough fingers. She said that her grandmother used to grow these flowers a long time ago, when Mirae was little. Sehyun stood behind her, said yes, that these were the same flowers, that they had been waiting. Mirae didn't answer. She stood up, went into the house, like the mistress of the house, not like a guest. She kicked the door open, walked down the hallway, peered into every room. Ethan followed her and said nothing. She found her old room, small, at the very end of the hallway, empty, nothing but dust and bare walls. She went inside. She stood in the middle. Then she sat down on the floor, crossed her legs, closed her eyes. Ethan left and closed the door behind him. Mirae needed time. The first week was difficult. Mirae didn't trust Ethan. She looked at him as if he were a puzzle to be solved. She sprinkled pepper into his porridge on the second morning. He ate it without wincing. Herin helped. A neutralizer made from mint leaves. He placed it under his tongue before eating. Mirae watched. He could tell she'd taken note. She hid his tools on the 3rd day, a chisel and a hammer,
He found them within an hour. Yunso had told him where the carpenter kept his tools, the same places as 600 years ago. Meyer sat on the roof of the building and watched him search. When he found them, she didn't smile, but her eyes became slightly less hostile. She was testing him, testing the limits. Like a child who is returned to a family and doesn't believe they won't be cast out again. Ethan understood. He didn't rush her. He didn't scold her. He didn't explain. He simply was there, every day, in the same place.
Doing the same things. Morning, medicine for Sehyun.
Breakfast, work in the garden, calligraphy, tea preparation, dinner, sleep. Repeat. Stability as a form of trust. On the 8th day, Mirae went out into the garden and stood next to Sehyun, who was watering the asters. She picked up a second watering can. She began to water, silently. Sehyun looked at her. Mirae didn't look back, but she watered beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Ethan saw this from the kitchen window. Hedin was crying against the back of his head, quietly, warmly. On the 10th day, Mirae approached Ethan while he was practicing calligraphy on a stone. She stood behind him, watching. Then she said his lines were crooked. Ethan turned around. She wasn't joking. She could see. Mirae knew how to see lines and shapes. 10 years of training in the temple. The body remembers right angles and precise distances. Combat calligraphy. He asked if she could show him. She snorted, picked up a stick from the ground,
Drew a line in the air. Vertical.
perfect, from the top of her head to the ground. The movement was as precise as a strike, because for her, it was a strike. Ethan watched. The system flashed. Not a new module, something else. A compatibility map. He suddenly saw how Meyer's combat skills, Nayun's calligraphy, Yunso's carpentry, and Herin's herbalism came together as a single picture. They didn't conflict. They resonated. Each skill enhanced the other. The precision of the combat gives calligraphy its sharpness. Calligraphy gives carpentry its beauty. Carpentry gives herbalism structure. Herbalism gives combat healing after wounds. A circle, closed, whole, like a family. He told Meyer about the modules, about the system, about the ancestors who live in his head. She listened, her face tense, skeptical. Then she asked if she could hear them too, and Tan shook his head. He said that the ancestors speak through him, but the power belongs to Sehyun and Meyer.
They are the bearers of the blood. He is only a conduit.
Meyer looked at him for a long time. Then she said that if he hurt her sister, she would break both his arms. She said it calmly, like a fact. Ethan nodded. He said he remembered. On the 12th day after their return, what Ethan had been waiting for since day one happened. Evening, kitchen, dinner, everyone at the table. Sehyun, Meyer, Mrs. Wan, Ethan. Rice with vegetables and boiled eggs, an oil lamp on the wall, warm light. Meyer ate greedily, as always. Then she slowed down. She looked at her sister. Sehyun caught her gaze. Meyer said that the porridge here was better than at the temple. Sehyun snorted, quietly. Meyer snorted in response, louder. Then they both fell silent. Then Sehyun smiled, fully, with both corners of her mouth, both eyes
her whole face. The first full smile in 12 years. Meyer saw that smile and looked away, quickly. But Ethan saw it. Her lips twitched. She almost smiled back. Almost.
That evening, Ethan went out into the yard. He stood by the well. He looked up at the sky, the stars, strangers, not quite foreign anymore. The system opened a window, quietly, soundlessly. Synergy had reached a new level. Family resonance activated. All existing modules enhanced. Access to the deep layers of heritage opened. He closed the window. Didn't read the details. Looked at the house. Warm light in the windows. Behind the walls, Sehyun and Mirae, and Mrs. Won. And tomorrow, Iris will come. And across the street, Baron Villard, who gets up on his own and eats on his own. And somewhere in the capital, the appraiser Evelyn, who chose silence over denunciation. And at the market, the old woman who sleeps like a baby, and the merchant whose daughter wept over a scroll of good wishes. A small network, a small world, built of tea and calligraphy and wooden hinges and purple flowers. A world he had assembled piece by piece, like a system, like an engineer. But not from wires and servers, from people. And every node in this network was held together not by contracts and protocols, by care, by attention, by a cup of tea served with trembling hands on the first night. He returned to the house. He lay down. He closed his eyes. Heron was warm. Young So was warm. For the first time in all these days, Na-Yan was not icy, but cool, like a mountain stream, like the morning breeze. The three ancestors in his head were home, because he had brought them home. Through the blood of a quiet girl who draws chrysanthemums. Through the hands of a bold girl who draws lines in the air. Through an old garden with purple flowers by a broken fountain. Through a letter from a grandfather who knew he would die, but believed that someone would come and gather what he had laid out in pieces. Someone came. An engineer, from another world, who had spent his whole life assembling other people's systems, and, for the first time, assembled his own. In the next room, Sehyun was humming softly, without words, a simple melody. Next to her, Mirae was breathing in her sleep, evenly, calmly. For the first time in 10 years, in a room next to her sister. Ethan listened, and the three ancestors in his head listened. And somewhere deep within the sealed blood from 847 years ago, Herin was smiling. And 612 years ago, Yunso was putting his tools on the workbench and saying that was enough for today. And 420 years ago, Nayeong was placing her brush in the holder and closing the inkstone. They were home. Everyone. Finally.